Good morning. Ooh, that's very loud. Thanks all to all of you for trekking out on, of course, what is one of the nastiest days of the season thus far, but I'm really heartened to see a great turnout here for the first of our ADA trainings. And you all should consider yourselves very special because this is the pilot training, and what we hope that you will do in addition to learning and participating very actively today is to provide us a lot of feedback on what works, what doesn't, what you were hoping to get out of today, and what you'd like to see in the future. So I'm really pleased to have all of you here today. My name is Linda Mastandria. I'm the director of CMAP's ADA and Local Safety Planning Initiative. And we have been busy building up a team since I came on with the agency in April. You'll meet many of them throughout the day. You probably met most of them as you came in and registered. And we are here at your service. So anything you need during the course of the day, please let one of us know. Everybody on the ADA team, please raise your hand in the back so they know who to look for. All right. So any one of them will be happy to help you with whatever you need today. I really hope that you're here ready to listen, to learn, to engage, to talk. We don't want this to be just a one-way pushing out of information. We really want to hear from all of you and have conversation throughout the day. So very, very much, again, excited for all of you to be here and to participate and to learn with us. And with that, I want to turn it over to our consultant team. And I'll first introduce you to Travis Helmkamp, who is the project manager for the consultant team, who has put together the wonderful program that you're about to experience today.
Thank you very much, Linda. Is the microphone picking me up? Okay, I'm just gonna have to hold it then. A couple housekeeping items first. This meeting is being recorded both in here and virtually, so just a. Oh. Yeah. Oh. Now we're getting fancy. I like this. So yeah, again, it is being recorded. We do have people joining virtually. So if you would like to ask questions, take part, everybody should have a microphone in their vicinity. Green is on, red is muted. So we do ask that you unmute the microphone and talk into the microphone so the virtual attendees can hear as well. We do have ample time for questions. The goal of this is to really get your feedback. We have prepared what we think you guys want to hear. If it's not what you want to hear, please tell us, because we're going to be doing 12 of these over the next year and a half. And this is ultimately about helping those local municipalities develop these plans. So if at the end of the day, you're like, I really wanted to hear about this, we still have time to change this. We're not doing our first one until January. So please provide that feedback to us so we can make this as good as we can make it for you guys. Because ultimately for the project team, and I'll speak for CMAP here, this is about how we can service you guys. This is about how we can help you, about how we can give you the tools you need to do this going forward. Presentation goals for today. We'll see if this works. Technology, I love it. If I could just stand up here and talk, I would, but I think you guys would fall asleep, so we need pictures. We'll get this figured out by the second one. That's why this is the pilot presentation. So I don't guarantee this is going to go smooth, but I do guarantee you'll be out of here by 1 because CMAP has another meeting. So we're not going along. Whatever happens, we will be out of this room. If you can go to the next slide, Jake. Really, first things first, we want to introduce ourselves. You're going to be seeing a lot of us over the next year and a half. So just kind of want to talk about why we're here, what we're here to do. We do have sort of 4 distinct modules that we're going to talk about today. Lastly, it is that feedback. So raise your hands, ask questions, take part. If we can go to Cheryl, if we can go to the next slide. First things first, my name is Travis Helmkamp. I'm a project manager at Oates. Sort of the last 12 years of my life has been dedicated to ADA transition plans. Large communities, small communities. I've done communities with as small as 12 miles of sidewalk. I've done communities with over 1,800 miles of sidewalk. So I think it's important to note that ADA transition plan is not a one-size-fits-all model. So that's really one thing that we're hoping to sort of share with you guys today is that it's custom for what your city's looking for. Next slide, Cheryl. Mike Bush is the project principal for Oates. He's over there in the polo shirt. He's our principal on this job, and really his area of expertise is the local municipality side. So what he's really bringing to the team is he knows how local municipalities think, and that's really what we're focusing on is we don't want to stand up here as the government. We want to stand up here as we've done this for the local communities, and we want to make it as good as we can for you guys. Next slide. Okay, Robin Jones is the director of the Great Lakes ADA Center. She does ADA training all throughout the area, so you may have already seen her before. She's also a professor at UIC and really kind of does these trainings throughout the nation. Next slide. Lastly, we have Jim DeYoung. He's the former director of the Great Plains ADA Center, and really his area of expertise is ADA coordinators. On top of everything else with the ADA, he formed the ADA coordinator training program, which is a way for them to go out and get training, as well as the ADA National Symposium. If any of you guys are looking for sort of in-depth 2-day, 3-day, very intensive training, ADA National Symposium is a great option. Next year it's in Kansas City, so it is fairly close. Next slide. We do have sort of 4 main modules here. Module 1 and 2, I'll say, are very global modules. ADA and Title II in general, and then the ADA coordinator and sort of that broad role that they serve. The last 2 modules are very much focused on sidewalks, curb ramps, and public right-of-way. So first 2 modules, sort of the big picture, everything that's involved in the ADA. Last 2 modules, we're going to get down to that. How does that apply to sidewalks, curb ramps, and pedestrian facilities? Next slide. Sort of our expectations of you guys. Number 1, ask questions. If you have a question, please ask it. Honest feedback. If this doesn't work, tell us it doesn't work. We got to stand up here and do this 12 more times. So if you don't get anything out of this, no one's going to get anything out of this for the next 1.5 years. And tell us what we can do better. Next slide, Cheryl. With that in mind, we have sort of 3 overarching questions that we're going to ask you guys at multiple times throughout. First one is, did you find this information useful? Second one is there anything you think that we're missing? And then, is there any information we should put more emphasis on? Today is just the pilot presentation, so we're going to hit on stuff fairly lightly. But if we talk about something and you say, that's what I need for my community, tell us, because then we know for the future modules that that's what you guys are looking for. Cheryl, next slide. And with that, I'll hand it off to Robin Jones to start on the ADA and Title II training.
A little bit shorter than you, but it works. All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see everybody here and be here. I may have again met some of you along the way. I have been the director of the Great Lakes ADA Center since 1991. I guess that dates me right after the ADA was passed. If you're not familiar with the Great Lakes ADA Center, I'll just give a little plug for a second here, is under Title V of the ADA, which I know all of you have read the ADA from front to back, I am sure. But you may not remember that under Title V of the ADA, there is a requirement that all federal agencies have technical assistance available on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this was largely due to the disability advocacy community coming forth and saying, hey, we have this tendency in this country to pass laws And then we don't provide information about how to comply with them. And so they often get labeled as unfunded mandates and all kinds of other things. And they often will go by the wayside because without information about how to comply, often entities don't comply because they don't know what to do. So the disability community has had enough experience in previous legislation that they really went to Congress and said, this is really an important thing to ingrain in the law and make it a requirement that all federal agencies have technical assistance so people know where to go and can get information about how to comply with the law. So the federal government established the technical assistance in their federal agencies. So you've got Department of Justice has technical assistance, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has technical assistance, the U.S. Access Board has technical assistance, the Department of Transportation, et cetera. But they also understood and knew that people have a tendency to call hesitancy to call federal agencies and ask questions, because it's often, if I'm talking about a problem I'm having with a federal agency, there's this fear that they're going to turn around and investigate me at the same time, because you've now got both compliance and technical assistance melded into the same place. And so there's a fear there, even though that's not what happens, that's definitely what happens. Also, most of the technical assistance at the federal level is happening in DC, in the Beltway of DC, which has little to no orientation to what's happening in Chicago, or it's happening in northern Minnesota, or down in southern Illinois, or wherever else in regards to just the politics or the terrain or other kinds of things. So they worked with the federal agencies to formulate these 10 centers across the country known as the ADA National Network. And so we all have a geographic area, and I have Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin as my territory that I cover. And we are promoting voluntary compliance. We are not involved in enforcement in any way, shape, or form. We're strictly to help people understand, walk through, talk through, or whatever, what their obligations and such are. So that's just a little bit about our centers, and goes into, and that leads me into this kind of concept of disability rights and how we got to where we are today. Some of you are going to say, well, why am I having to listen to this particular part of this? We want to talk about sidewalks. This is what we do. You know, we're part of this, you know, other thing. I think it's really important to understand where this all comes from and the importance of it. Many of us can think about things in regards to, you know, sidewalks and such of that nature, or roadways and crosswalks and stuff of that nature. And, oh, people with disabilities, you know, those people in wheelchairs and such of that nature. But the disability community is very large and very diverse. In fact, there's probably people in this room who would fit into the category of people with a disability. The majority of disability is actually invisible. It's not visible. Actually, only about 16% of the population of people with disabilities uses crutch, cane, or any kind of mobility device. The majority of disability would be that hidden disability, mental health, individuals with heart conditions or seizure disorders or other kinds of conditions and such. So, you know, I think the one thing that's always been pointed out or has been really focal and big when you look at these issues is the fact that the group of individuals who have physical disabilities have faced the greatest amount of barriers in our society, because it's not that they are disabled, it's society that has disabled them. It's the fact that we have too many stairs, and that we don't have ramps, you know, and that our doors are too heavy, or they're not wide enough, or we don't have elevators and things of that nature, that has really made the world disabling for people who have different types of impairments and such. So you have to kind of understand where we've come and where we've gone and where we are today. So we look all the way back, and, you know, in some ways we shouldn't even be sitting here today, because all of you should have been fully in compliance already due to what we know as the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which said under Section 504, and has many sections within it, but the one of the most pertinent and important here is Section 504 is the requirement that says anyone who receives federal funds cannot discriminate against people with disabilities. So any municipality that has taken federal funds from the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 should have been making their buildings accessible, should have had their roadways accessible, their sidewalks accessible, et cetera. And the conversation with the ADA passage in 1990 should only have been oh, okay, here's another piece of legislation that does similar and moves us along. But what happened is the ADA was a wake-up call. Everyone had kind of ignored, you know, or forgotten about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And so then the ADA comes along, and it has a much broader, because it goes beyond just federal dollars. There's no carrot and stick anymore. The 504 was about a carrot and stick. You want our federal money, you agree to do a certain thing. And you didn't have that anymore. But Section 504 was really a really important issue, and it applies to anybody who receives federal funding, and not just that thing that receives the federal funds, but the entity and everything that they do. So I may receive federal funds from my police department, but that means my community itself is subject to 504. It doesn't just the police department that got the federal funds. It's overarching across the board. And it doesn't matter how much money you got. You could have gotten $10. And it's going to have coverage and protections. We also then had the Civil Rights Restoration Act that came about, and then the Americans with Disabilities Act. And many of you, again, depending on your age, may have been familiar with the ADA and its passage and the fight for the ADA, but largely it was a bipartisan piece of legislation. Disability doesn't have a partisan event to it. It's anybody, and I always remind people of this, that it is the one protected class that any one of us can become a member of at any time, from birth to death. There's nothing that is a barrier for anybody here to themselves. And as we age, we know that as we age, we acquire more disabilities. So you think about it in the context of who we're thinking about in that audience, using sidewalks and crosswalks and things of that nature, being those individuals who, we use crutches, canes, and things of that nature, but also it's much broader than that. And we don't think of it as just a disability issue, but it's a justice issue. It's an equal access issue for everybody. So we're also talking about mothers with strollers, and we're talking about the salesperson with a wheelie bag behind them. We're talking about the skateboarder, even though we don't like them on our sidewalks necessarily, or whatever it might be. But it's really a broad use of these things, that accessibility. And I would say that, build it and they shall come. Don't build it when they come. Next slide, please. So just to understand that, the ADA is just this one piece of legislation, and get it in context of all of the pieces of legislation, because one of the biggest things under the ADA is confusion. We like to apply the ADA to everything. And on my TA line, I spend a lot of time talking to people about what the law doesn't cover, because everyone thinks that it covers everything. So we start with the Rehabilitation Act, which was passed in '73. Unfortunately, Section 504 took several years to pass because there was a lot of angst within, or disagreement within the administrative level of our government about signing it. There was a lot of concerns about cost, how much it was going to cost to implement Section 504. And there was just a lot of dragging the feet. And it really took a huge groundswell. The disability community learned from the civil rights movement in the 60s about civil disobedience and how effective that was in regards to getting attention and getting things passed. And there was a lot of civil disobedience that occurred, peaceful civil disobedience that occurred around the passage and the signing of Section 504 to get it implemented. So it took 5 years from the passage of the Rehab Act to Section 504 being actually put into place. So it didn't actually go into place until 1978. In that midst of all of that, we look at education, and of course, educating children with disabilities, a huge issue. You think about it, and anybody again here, I'll easily admit I'm in my mid-60s, and I didn't go to school with kids with disabilities. Kids with disabilities went to another school. My school wasn't accessible. They would never have been able to get into my school. There were no services for them, et cetera. They were bused to another school, actually in another town. So they didn't even necessarily have friends from the same town because they had to go to a school someplace else. In 1975, with the passage of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that really reformed our education system for individuals with disabilities. So the ADA does not specifically address education. It addresses schools and the accessibility of schools. It addresses how we use schools for things like extracurricular activities and things of that nature. But that classroom, that education that child needs in the classroom, that's driven by both the Rehabilitation Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now, once I graduate and I get past that 12th grade or the age of 21, depending on when I graduate or I get out of the school system, then I'm going to go into ADA for post-secondary ed or other issues. But the ADA does not specifically deal with that individual classroom situation. Then, of course, the airlines, and we've heard a lot about the airlines in the last couple of years around different issues of accessibility. If you're following any of that, people with disabilities have long, even though they have rights under the Air Carrier Access Act, to get their wheelchair stowed, to get onto the airplane. We still don't have accessible bathrooms on airplanes. We still have that people have to transfer out of their own wheelchair and risk, seating issues for them, or risk their chair being damaged by the airlines because they go and stow them underneath and throw them in the baggage, and they get ruined or destroyed or whatever. They still have to wait hours sometimes to get their chair delivered to them at the plane side after they've landed. Sometimes they're forgotten and left on the plane because the stewardesses leave and they forgot, oops, there's people still on the plane that need to get exited. So there's still a lot of problems, but it's a lot better than it used to be. And it still does provide greater access than it ever has. And there was a law that needs more work, and there's still things happening with that. The Fair Housing Act of 1988 was actually the amendments. The original Fair Housing Act was passed in the 60s. It was amended in 88. And this is where we added disability in two ways. One was architectural access. So buildings that are built and constructed after that date, after the implementation, 4 or more units are required to be adaptable. So that's where we see construction in housing. So we don't really look to the ADA for housing. We look to the ADA for housing if it's owned and operated by a local government, a dormitory at a university, something that's associated with a social services like a halfway house or something of that nature. But when we're looking at private residential housing, a condo, apartment, et cetera, we're looking to the Fair Housing Act primarily for that construction and such. But it also has requirements for non-discrimination in rental and sale. It has requirements in it for individuals being able to make modifications to their home if necessary to make it independently accessible to them. And also things like service animals and emotional support animals and things of that nature also are covered under the Fair Housing Act. And then of course we get to the ADA. So what the importance of understanding this is there's a myriad of laws. It's not just one piece of legislation that is driving a lot of what we do and how we look at accessibility. And it really, you have to go back and say, what is the situation? What is the scenario? And then which law applies to it? And there may be overlapping. So obviously Section 504 and the ADA overlap a lot. There's a huge amount of overlap there. Next slide, please. So how did we get there? We got, again, as I said, we've gotten here through education, through civil disobedience. But again, education has been the key issue. You sitting here today is part of this process. Everyone needs to learn this process. You can't necessarily pick it up in the book. As I joke about reading the ADA from front to back, if you did, more power to you. But if you, most of us have not, because it's legalese. It doesn't often mean a lot to us. What does it mean when I start talking about Title II, Title III, Title I? It's a lot of jargon and such. So what does it actually mean to me? Advocacy, there's been this real healthy tension in the advocacy community between wanting to work with you and understand that, okay, we know this is new to you. We know that you're still making strides and things of that nature, but at the same time, you know what? It's 32 years past the passage of the ADA. And why are your sidewalks? Why are your curb cuts still not accessible? Why are your buildings still have barriers? There's a point where my tolerance to allow, or to give you that go or that pass is waning. We're not going to, and that's why we're seeing more and more litigation in this area. We're seeing more and more attention to it and such of that nature, because you've had 32 years. And so it's no longer to tell me that you can't afford it. It's too expensive. You've had 32 years to budget for it. So it's not about just this year's budget or last year's budget. You've had this time to plan. You've had this time to put this into place. And this is a really important, so that there's this kind of healthy tension. We now have 3 generations of what I call the ADA generation, 3 generations of individuals who have been born with rights. There's that whole group of people that were born prior to the ADA who had to fight for their rights. But then there's this group who's been born since, that they were born with rights. So they are far less tolerant than the group that before that has used to fighting for their rights and has, given people more passes and things of that nature. So really understand that, we've got this group of, advocates and people, that are much more and less tolerant of letting you get a pass or letting it go by that you, weren't able to budget for it or whatever else it might be that you're looking at. And then of course, enforcement, the enforcement process, Department of Justice being the main enforcement entity, Department of Transportation in the space that we often are looking at here with the Highway Administration and things of that nature, looking at these things. But most of what has happened in the enforcement area has been through complaints being filed by people in the community, and then typically looking at mediation. mediation, trying to get it mediated, because it doesn't do any of us good to get into the courts, because the only one that's happening there is the lawyers. They're the ones who are making money off of this issue, whether it be your corporate lawyers, it be the other side's corporate lawyers. So it's not productive to get to that point. So hopefully if you are facing those things, or you have faced those things, that you are looking at mediation and trying to, right the wrong instead of forcing it into any kind of a litigation type of situation. So I'm going to talk about what are the administrative requirements under the ADA. Most of you hopefully may be aware of those administrative requirements. You're going to say, well, some of these aren't applicable to, it's not my job. It's not in my job description or whatever it is. But I think it's important that you understand the context of which all of this falls into it. Because under Title II of the ADA, the Department of Justice, when they laid out their regulations, laid out 5 administrative requirements. And these administrative requirements are really the crux and the core of compliance with Title V of the ADA. Now, first, and I talked and I alluded to the issue of, people with disabilities being much broader than just that person in the wheelchair and such of that nature. And as you look and as we talk today, and Jim's going to talk about ADA coordinator stuff and things like communication and such, it all fits together. It's all part of access. I don't just walk on the sidewalk. I walk on the sidewalk to get someplace to be able to participate in an activity. So it's all wraps in together. So the first of the administrative requirements, and Jim's going to go to a lot more detail on this, is designating a responsible employee. Now, we often hear and talk to it about it being an ADA coordinator, and you'll hear that terminology. And some of you, I'd be curious, anyone here serving in the ADA coordinator role in your municipality? Okay, great. Are you the only ADA coordinator, or are there others, like there's somebody in HR and there's somebody in another agency? Some of you are the only ADA coordinator. Okay. All right, great. So, and do you use terminology ADA coordinator, or use something else? Okay, mostly ADA coordinator, but we see a lot of different titles being used in this particular position, and we see it placed in a lot of different places, and Jim will talk about that. But the real key issue in this position, in this role, is it has to be someone with sufficient authority to make decisions and act on behalf of the municipality. To just give it to somebody as a title and say, okay, we've got it. We've got somebody with that title and such, but they don't have authority to actually act is meaningless, because this position needs to be able to take action. They need to be able to take direction. They need to be able to give direction. They may be able to spend dollars if they need to spend dollars, and, and require things. So that is the number one administrative requirement. The second administrative requirement is a grievance procedure. This is a really critical requirement under the ADA, because this is where you potentially avoid that litigation that I'm talking about. Because by having a process internally that someone can grieve, if they feel that you as a municipality have not done what you should do, if you've got broken sidewalks, if you've got missing curb cuts, if you've got some other building structural issues, if you haven't provided a sign language interpreter at a meeting or something of that nature, you're giving me an avenue to bring that forward to you to try to get it remedied before I get to the point where I'm saying, darn it, I'm going to go right into the courts. I'm going to file a complaint. I'm going to get my own attorney. I'm going to sue you, because nobody wins in that particular situation. Now, you already may have grievance procedures in your municipalities that are used for other things. It's fine. You can amend that grievance procedure and use it for this purpose. The key is making sure the public knows that that's available to them, and that's an option that they have available to them. So making that as a clear issue, having that and publicizing it so that people know that they have that option. Who do I go to if I have a grievance? What is the procedure? And then what's more important is actually use the procedure as it's intended. Don't just use it as something that, okay, we have it in the books, check. It's that we actually use it, that we have a process, that we actually have, and we get results, and we actually do what we say we're going to do, and we follow through with that. Next. This slide just is a illustration, kind of a visual illustration of the fact that this whole issue of compliance and being the compliance manager is a real delicate balance, because on one end, you're the CYA for your municipality. Okay, you are the person that is helping and keeping them out of the courts. You're out of the administrative complaint process and things, or the potential of loss of your federal funds because you didn't do what you were supposed to do under Section 504 or whatever it is. But at the other hand, you also are interfacing with the citizenry. You're interfacing with the public. You are wanting to make sure that their needs are met. So you're balancing both things of the fact that, okay, I need to make the municipality happy. I need to make them whole. I need to make sure that they don't, get in trouble, whatever, but I also have a citizenry that's just needing things, and they might conflict at times with what I want versus what, is going to be available. And you're going to have to play that balancing act there in regards to what can we do? Maybe we can't come to the absolute best. Maybe we have to do something less and we move to the best, or we work, or we try to achieve that, but at least we're doing something. At least we're moving towards that, and we're taking those strides. So that balance is really important to understand where you're at with that. Next. The third administrative requirement is notice to the public. How many here can tell me that that you have notice on your website, on your flyers, on all of your documents that go out, of the fact that you have compliance with the ADA, and that if somebody has questions or has issues, this is who they contact, and how they go about doing that? How many can tell me that you have that on your website, on your documents and things of that nature? Not very many of you, a few of you. All right. This is a really critical requirement. This notice to the public is something that you have got to make sure, and it's ongoing. It's not a one-time deal. Oh yeah, on November 14th of 2022, we published it and in the newspaper or whatever. Or it has got to be something that you're ongoingly doing, that it is included in all your documents that you put out, all your notices that you put out, that it's on your website and easy to find on your website and such. This is a really critical. People need to know, because the worst thing, and you all know this, that if people don't know or don't know where to go, they get more frustrated, they get more angry, and they get, more likely to be combative about the situation. If people know and understand and know that there's a voice out there and somebody they can talk to and where to go, and they know that their community is doing something, they're going to be much more readily willing to work with you on issues than work against you on issues. Then the last two administrative requirements, of which we're going to get to the meat of later today, is the conducting of a self-evaluation. Now, the self-evaluation I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about, but that's basically an assessment of all your programs and services to identify any barriers to participation by people with disabilities. And it's required of all entities, regardless of the size of the entity. So this is basically your review of all of your programs and services to identify, where do we have barriers? Where do we have things that are lacking? And, we're going to get a lot more detail to that. And Travis is going to talk to it in much more detail as it relates specifically to streets and sidewalks and things of that nature. But understand this is a global requirement across the board of all programs and services. And then the fifth administrative requirement, next slide, is the development of the transition plan. The transition plan becomes the blueprint for how we move forward when we have barriers that we need to remove. It is only required for entities of 50 or more employees, which I think, as I was looking through the list of who was attending today, most of you had more than 50 employees, because it doesn't matter. It's not FTEs, it's head count. So it's, times of year and different things. Now, I'm going to make a caveat. You see my star on here, that it was only originally required to be completed by July 26 of 1992, with all barriers to be removed in 1995. And we are in 2022. So you're saying, well, why are we talking about this? These requirements are gone. And if you talk to the Department of Justice, they're going to tell you these requirements have come and gone. They're past. They were supposed to have been done. The issue is these become tools now for you to get to compliance, because we know, how many of you can tell me that you had your self-evaluation and transition plan completed by 1995 and all your barriers removed? Yeah. Okay. So that's why we're here. And that's why this is an issue. People didn't do it. It was probably not very realistic when they drafted the legislation to think that it was going to happen in that period of time. But, that's hindsight, whatever. We move on from that. It is a tool for you to use. And another thing that it is a demonstration of good faith effort. It's the fact that we do recognize that we have these issues, that we do recognize that we have a problem, and that we have a plan in place of how we're going to remove those problems. They become our tool to be able to demonstrate to the public if we were ever in a litigation situation, we could demonstrate that good faith effort in regard to that litigation as well. I've seen it used by municipalities as a defense that, hey, yes, this area is not accessible yet, but here's our plan. This is what we're doing in the meantime. You know, here is what's going on with it. Next. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've alluded to already, the possibilities of noncompliance. So one, I'll tell you, you can get a lot harsher outcome if you ended up in litigation than you do if you do it voluntarily. You don't want the courts. Ask the city of Chicago. I don't know if anybody's here from the city of Chicago, but ask the city of Chicago about their curb cut lawsuit and how that mandated a particular number of curb cuts that had to be done on a schedule that was determined by the courts, not the city of Chicago. It determined how much money the city of Chicago was going to have to spend on removing those curb cut barriers, not the city of Chicago City Council determining how much they were going to allocate to those particular things. So you can get a much harsher outcome in the litigation than you might without litigation. Bad press. None of us want bad press. None of us want to be the front pages of the newspaper to talk about the lawsuit that you got filed against you for what you had not done. It generates ill will in your citizenry and stuff as well, because they're often not aware of these things being a problem. And then it gets brought to their attention. It becomes an issue. The possibility of becoming part of DOJ's Project Civic Access subject. Project Civic Access is a program that the Department of Justice has under Title II, whereby they proactively go out to communities and review those communities for their compliance under the Title II of the ADA. And if they find barriers, they basically file an action against you, and you end up in a settlement agreement potentially with them that is going to dictate what you have to do and what you're not going to want to do. And I'm going to talk about a case study of city of Milwaukee in a little while about that. Now, we've had 4 civic access in Illinois, and so there are 4 communities that could tell you and learn from you. The closest one to us would be Waukegan. Had a project that's the closest to the Chicago area. There's others are in other parts of the state. You could be subject to private lawsuits and settlement agreements. Again, as I said, that good faith effort really goes a long way, especially if you've engaged the community. We're going to talk about community engagement in the process and how important that is. And then again, you could have somebody else controlling what you do and dictating the process. And again, who wants that? Who wants to lose control of this process? You don't want to lose control of the process. You want to be in control of what you're having to do. So just really be mindful of the fact that there is the potential for liabilities and noncompliance. Next, please. So just some of the positive sides, and this is a compilation of images that really demonstrates, again, accessibility is something that broadens and opens for everybody. It opens our communities. It opens our communities for people of all ages. It opens our communities for families. A person with a disability doesn't just go to the park by themselves. They go with their family. So, everyone's barred the opportunity to enjoy that park if their family member can't get into it. Everybody is barred the ability to decide to walk down the street to go to a restaurant if the sidewalks aren't accessible because they have a family member who can't navigate those sidewalks because of the inaccessibility of those sidewalks and such. So we really have to keep in mind that accessibility impacts everybody. It's not just the person with a disability, it's their family members, it's the people that they're associated with. And again, that broader population of people that benefit from accessibility because we have, much of the research has shown accessibility when it's built into something benefits everybody, not just, and I can tell, we could do a survey and you don't have to, admit it here, but when you come up to an entrance and you've got steps in front of you and you've got a ramp in front of you, how many of you choose the ramp instead of the entrance, the stairs? And how many of us have used the accessible toilet room, and such of that nature? How many of us have coveted the accessible parking space, but have not illegally used the accessible parking space, but recognize that, there's benefit, there's a need for those things, and there's a reason for those things. So just keep that in mind, because it could be you, it could be your grandmother, it could be your wife, it could be your child, it could be your coworker that needs this accessibility tomorrow. Because again, disability can happen at any time. It could happen as an accident, it could happen as a disease process, etc. So just keep that in mind that, we're talking about global access for everybody in parks, in communities, in our streets, etc. Next slide. So I said I was going to talk about a case study of the city of Milwaukee. So Milwaukee underwent in 2016 a settlement agreement. And so the things that happened here were lack of person. They had nobody designated responsible person. They had no inventory of their barriers of anything that was constructed. They had numerous buildings that had been constructed since 1991 that were not accessible. They had no or little to no policies and procedures for communication. They had little to no inclusion of accessibility and emergency planning. They had a lot of public rights of way lacking any curb cuts in their commercial as well as residential areas. They had no policies in their police department to transport and detain individuals with disabilities, and a lack of accessible voting locations. Next slide. The findings or the outcome of that, they were required to name an ADA coordinator. They were required to establish an interagency coordinated council to make sure that there was coordination among agencies, so you don't have this person sitting up there that doesn't know what's happening among all of the various agencies and such. They were required to undergo an inventory of all buildings that were owned and operated, not just owned, but leased as well, and remove those barriers within 3 years. This is where that more prescriptive comes in. It wasn't their choice as to how long they wanted to take to do that. It was dictated to them. They had 3 years to do that. They had to inventory all public rights of way and remove those barriers at all their intersections in 3 years. I don't know how many, if I was going to come into your community today and say, you had to have that all done in 3 years, where are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? Not just logistically, or how are you going to do it financially? They had to do it. They had no choice. This was part of their settlement agreement. They were required to develop some policies on communication, and they were required to address their voting inaccessibility within 3 years also, and they were required to revamp their website in that 3-year period of time. I will let you know that what happened with the city of Milwaukee is that they did not meet all of their deadlines. They ended up having to have their settlement agreement extended by 2 years. So they had a settlement agreement for 5 years. They had these 3-year, and then they had 5 years total for the whole thing to happen. They ended up having to have it extended for 2 years, where they were continued to be monitored for non-compliance. So they got some stricter things attached to that. So it wasn't a good thing for them. It was positive, and they're still feeling some of the repercussions of that today, 6 years later. Next, questions about anything I've said up to this point? Okay. Yeah.
Microphone. Can you use microphone?
Ma'am, can you please,
Can you pass her that microphone? It's portable. There you
and
go.
if you press it so it's green, that's when we can hear you.
Great. I was just wondering if where we find those materials, if we want to institute these so we don't have to.
We're going to give you lots of resources. That's part of what we're doing, is we're giving you lots of resources of where you can figure all this stuff out, because there are a lot of things that have been developed to help you along the way. Definitely. All right, we'll keep going. Next. So just to briefly talk about the requirements again, Travis is going to go into much more depth of this. Broadly defined, a program, service, or activity under the ADA is anything that you do for a service or activity for a single purpose. It's anything that's undertaken by a department that affords benefits, information, or opportunities or activities that engages with the public. That's what it is. So it's very broad in regards. So it's everything that you do, basically. Examples, it's your parks, it's your recreation, your libraries, your voting, your meetings, your police and emergency preparedness, your web-based information and publications, all of your social services provided to the public, all your payment processes, your taxes, assessment processes, all your sidewalks, public rights of way, and in all programs and services that are carried out by contractors as well. That's a really key issue, because many of us privatize or contract away some of these things. That still rests with us. We cannot contract away our obligations. So even though we might privatize some of the activities that we have done in our municipalities, we still are obligated for those things to be accessible. We cannot make and the burden on the entity. We are responsible for that contractor's performance as well. Next. So the requirements for the self-evaluation is that you examine all of your program services activities, including your information technology websites, to identify where the barriers exist. Are they physical barriers? Are they policy barriers? Are they programmatic barriers? What kind of barriers are they? Evaluate how people with disabilities receive their services and participate, and any policies or practices that may potentially be discriminatory. Do we have an eligibility criteria that's discriminatory that says you must be able to walk, or that you must be able to talk, or something of that nature? Do we make sure that we develop then a priority-driven set of recommendations to ensure that all of our programs and services are accessible to people with disabilities? And again, your sidewalks are a program. You know, you have, they are part of what you do. And if we're building a new area and we're going to be inputting sidewalks into that area, if we're working with a developer who's putting in it and building a new area, what are we, you know, what's their obligations in regards to that? That's part of our programs, that whole issue. Next. In areas to examine, again, participation requirements, all your tests, participation policies and practices, existence of any separate programs or services. Do we have separate programs only for people with disabilities? What do those look like? What's our effective communication for people deaf, hard of hearing, or those that have issues with vision and sight as well? Infrastructure, what's our transportation look like? And that includes our bus pads as well as our actual physical transportation, the vehicles that we have, et cetera. Emergency preparedness, how are we including people with disabilities? What about the infrastructure when it breaks down? How are people with disabilities taken into consideration for those things? What is our use of outside entities and their compliance? Again, as I said, we're responsible for our external as well as our internal. What about our purchasing of furniture, equipment? What about our processes for purchasing? I can tell you horror stories of entities I've worked with that have made huge purchases and never took into consideration accessibility and took delivery on all signs. Let's say use an example of a very major hotel that I worked with out by O'Hare that had all new signage installed throughout the whole hotel when they did a major remodeling. Guess what? It was Braille, but it wasn't correct Braille because they did not have language or anything to monitor or assure that whoever they were taking delivery of that Braille from had done the Braille correctly. So they had great Braille signage. It just wasn't correct Braille signage. And they had to redo the entire thing because of that. But they took delivery of that product. They did not pay attention to the contractor delivering it appropriately. That's all part of your procurement policies, practices, and procedures. How are you holding them accountable for accessibility as well? And then web-based information. Again, how are our websites accessible? How are our kiosks or any apps that we're using in our municipality accessible to people who might have use assistive technologies and such? Next, please. This is a case example of how I would go about evaluating a program. Let's assume the facts of a public hearing. The meetings are held to conduct business and communicating with residents on a specific program. It could be held either in person or remote. Some are held on a regular basis. Some are responsive to urgent situations like fiscal issues, et cetera. I'm going to include each type of my meeting in that assessment because it could be different. What is the barrier for a remote meeting versus an in-person meeting? The type of meeting, is there public comment or is it just a talking head? All what's going on in there could present different types of challenges. So I need to determine, are my facilities where it's being held accessible? Is the notice that's given to the public include information about accommodation requests that might be needed, like sign language interpreters, et cetera, to participate? Is everything that's disseminated accessible? Is it in Braille or is it in large print or is it electronically accessible for somebody using their own assistive technology? And do people with disabilities have an equal opportunity to participate? Are they relegated to the back of the room? There's no speaker, there's no microphone. So when it comes to talk time, they don't have an opportunity to participate. Are they isolated in the process? How are we engaging people in that process and how are they able to participate? Next slide, please. Base requirements for the transition plan. Again, we'll be hearing a lot more in depth about that, specific to streets and sidewalks, but conducting a review of all facilities where all programs and services are carried out. Those are both those things that we own ourselves, but also that we may lease or where we may have cooperative agreements, et cetera, where we're conducting programs that are part of the municipality. Developing a list of all those barriers that limit the accessibility of any of those programs, services, and activities, and then identifying methods to remove the barriers and making those facilities accessible. Key here is establishing some type of a schedule to get the work completed, seeking input from the public regarding those priorities. And we're going to talk more about that in depth today. And then identifying the responsible person for the plan's implementation. It's not the ADA coordinator who's responsible for implementing this plan. They are a facilitator of the plan, but they are not the implementer of the plan. It could be streets and sanitation, it could be HR, it could be somebody else in your municipality that has that responsibility. And then really key is go back and revisit it. Let's see that, make sure what's our progress that we've made. Let's make sure we're ticking things off. Do we have to adjust our timelines? Has something occurred that we need to make a change? Is there something new that's happened since then? The pandemic. We didn't anticipate a pandemic. We may need to have to go back and make some modifications because of that along the way. So just make sure that you're also reviewing them on a regular basis. Here's just an example. Let's say City Hall, assuming the facts, it's open to the public on a regular basis. Residents can come to City Hall to carry out a variety of activities, paying bills, attending meetings, applying for services and benefits, meeting with the leadership. There's public parking lot that serves the building. There's restrooms that are open to the public. I need to determine all areas where the public has access and identify what barriers physical are that impede access to any of those areas that serve the public, evaluating them against the 2010 ADA standards, not the 1991 ADA standards. Those have come and gone. We now look at the 2010 ADA standards and identify any physical barriers that may impede an employee with a disability, identifying areas that are only used by employees as well. Do not forget your employee workforce. Even though you might not currently have an employee with a disability, you could hire an employee with a disability tomorrow, or one of your current employees could acquire a disability tomorrow through an accident, disease, or something else and would want to bring them back into the workplace. Next, please. So just another collage of pictures. Again, when we create accessible environments, when we assure that all of our programs and services are accessible, we then engage the public. We assure that our meetings have sign language interpreters, that we have access for people who have different methods of communication, that we have accessibility, equal access to be incarcerated, but also that people have equal access when we come to emergencies and other kinds of things. And then also that they can engage in the civic duties that we all have of voting and participation in the community. So these are really important that you think about it. It's not just broadly about or narrowly about fixing that door or fixing that curb or whatever. It's about how people use those things, how people engage, and how that ends up with how we have quality of life. And we want to live in your community. We don't want to, we want people to come to your community and find good things in your community, not bad things about your communities. So thank you very much. And we'll just ask a couple of questions here. We do have some resources. This is just an example. Go ahead, next slide.
Thank you. Yep.
I just review real quickly. I just stated about the goals of the module is understanding the obligations of the ADA coordinator. Under the ADA, IDing an ADA coordinator within your municipality, roles and responsibilities of that coordinator, developing an internal support system, and the available resources, which as Travis stated prior, this will be up on CMAP's website that you'll be able to download with hyperlinks to all the available resources. The obligations of the Title II entities, number one, it's required. And if you want to actually look at the exact law, you can be looking at 28 CFR 35.107 parentheses small a. I'm sorry, I got a little bit away from the microphone there. The commonly used title is ADA coordinator, but similar is allowed. I've had many ADA coordinators tell me across the country that they wish we had pushed more the item of it being ADA director rather than the coordinator. They felt as though that would give them more power within their organization. If you care to do that, perfectly allowable under the ADA to do so. But it should be directly employed by the municipality. We do not encourage under best practices hiring a consultant to carry out these activities as the coordinator. You may do it for a part of perhaps your sidewalks or something of that nature, but there has to be an individual within the municipality that people can reach. It could be a new hire you might need to do or an existing employee. I know when we first started this, and I know Robin can verify too, and just to let you know, Robin and I have worked together since the passage of the ADA nationally, is that usually when we asked if somebody was an ADA coordinator, they would indicate that they became so by missing a meeting or going to the bathroom at the wrong time. And so I think what we're finding now, though, is more enlightened folks that are volunteering or seeking that position. And so, but it may also be going on the other way still too. Regardless, is we need that to be published and announced who that ADA coordinator is through all communication channels that you utilize. The public needs to know who they need to contact, whether they have a grievance or whether they're looking just for more information about an upcoming event and its accessibility, or perhaps they're going to a new location and they'd like to know about the availability of parking and its access to the actual event. Something we learned this morning in parking in the garage. And we strongly encourage new signage to be put down there. But we did get a good tour of the garage, so I shouldn't complain. So in looking at the ADA coordinator in your community, in identifying the right candidate, our experience has told us that person clearly needs to have the ability to make decisions. They can't be someone who has to, who is so low on the totem pole that they're not able to make any. Time commitment, it takes a first contact attitude. What the heck do we, I think we all know that, is this person becomes the face of your municipality, becomes the face of your organization. And so if the phone gets answered, and Rob and I have gone through this with our staffs at times, if that gets answered, if you will, in a grumpy manner, it's not going to set the negotiation or the communication in a very positive direction. Don't want to over harp on this, but we want it to be more the attitude of, for instance, you're calling a place that's smiling more than when you're calling your local bank, if you will. So we think that's a very important in your consideration when trying to identify the right candidate. We're not looking for somebody that's just happy all the time, if you will, but we are looking for somebody that can take the right attitude to the public. The ability to listen and communicate is obviously very important. How that communication occurs, we're not saying it has to be orally like I'm doing, but they must be able to communicate in whatever modem that they use to communicate. Organization and communication skills, because as we'll see as we get into this, there's an awful lot of interaction going on, not only with the public, but within your community as well, within your municipality. So we feel that's very important. A willingness to learn and then to follow up on issues. Obviously does us no good if all we do is listen to them and 6 months later we're calling back with the same issue. I quickly relate to you an experience, and I'm going to take it out of Title II into a Title III thing so I don't insult anyone. And that is the fact that if we look, for instance, at hotels as covered under the ADA, the parking lot's covered, access to the front door is covered, access within the hotel is covered, your check-in, you're going to the restaurant, the bar, the bathrooms, swimming pool, etc. You get up in your room, you can get into the bathroom, but you make this wild decision in a lodging facility that you now want to go to bed, and the bed is not controlled at all by the ADA standards. There's not a height given in there. So what happened in somewhere in the 90s, the industry decided that you all wouldn't stay at their place unless the beds were highly elevated, that exemplified luxury. And so they were raised to sometimes 28 inches high. Just to let you know, I sit about 19 inches. You sit about the same, 18. And so we basically need pole vaults to get into these, beds. And they're not usable and pretty illogical that there you have a lodging facility and you can use everything but the bed. And so that's an example of what we're talking about here. When we look at the ADA coordinator roles and responsibilities, they'll vary based on the size of your community. I mean, what's going to work for Oak Park might be a little bit different than what works for Cary. Okay, and so we acknowledge that and will assist you in trying to tailor based on your size, because we do recognize that there's a great variety of the 270 some suburbs, I believe. And so that's one thing to look at. Oversee all aspects of the municipality's ADA implementation. Very important that that person understands what's going on in public works, understand what's going on in public affairs, perhaps also. And also to never forget the fact of information technology and the accessibility of your website. Too often I have worked with very eager communities, if you will, left there and checked their website maybe 2-3 months later and totally inaccessible. And so it's very important that you look at the communication access being accessible on the websites as well. They need to also establish, publicize, the community does, to establish, publicize, and follow up and document the ADA grievance procedure. I need to be able to know where to find that, and it should be very obvious and easy to be seen either on your websites or all materials. I think Robin and Travis were earlier talking about how just being able to add to your header or on the lower part of all documents going out can be very assistive for people to be able to realize what that might be. A person, very important to create and maintain a documentation process, not only for themselves, but all activities going on within the government. The example being, as Robin spoke about, if the U.S. Department of Justice comes knocking on your door, there is a thing in the ADA that's very clear about good faith effort. And if you're able to come out with your accordion full of documentation, it's going to go a long way as compared to, oh, I promise you we did that. So I tend to instruct people to think of it basically as you would all your insurance material. Begin that folder and document everything within there and keep a record of that throughout the years. Keep it as long as you can. So that would be the role of the ADA coordinator, put that process in place. Now, am I saying they have to handle each piece of paper? No. I'm saying there has to be a process, though, electronically would probably be best at these days to be able to get to those documents. Outreach and maintain relationships with the community. Am I reaching this microphone well enough? I feel like I'm bending over about to take a bite of it. So maybe I'll pull it up here. There we go. I feel a little more comfortable. The outreach and maintain relations with the community. Robin spoke about people with disabilities and sort of this balance of the ADA coordinator. It's critical that you not only get to the Jim DeYoungs, if you will, or the wheelchair user that you might know down the street, but also to talk to the organizations. Many of you have centers for independent living, which may operate in your area. You may have a developmental disability facility, but to create communication with those entities that represent disability could also be the Spina Bifida Association or multitude of different organizations based on disability. But to get communication occurring with them, which will be very important to you in the long run. When we start to look at 10,000. Oh, there we go. Sure, I feel much better. For Highland Park, we just adjusted the height of my microphone. And anyone else who's online. But it's very important to create an ongoing relationship. The community can assist you a great deal in identifying the barriers within your community the best, as well as some of the solutions to that. Because of the fact we are living this daily, we can provide that feedback to you, what might work, what might not work. We'll discuss that a little bit when we do the case example and all of you get to talk to me instead. So hang on to those thoughts. But ongoing education of disability laws and regulations are critically important for the person in this role. And one of the things that we just want to remind people is they'll need to stay up to date, not only on the ADA and federal law, as you've heard about, or as Robin had the discussion, but state law, local ordinances as well. So you've got kind of 3 tiers that's very important, both federal, state, and local. Oh. There is one part of the ADA, of course, that you have. The ADA is also an employment issue, Title I, under the ADA. We're not necessarily saying that the ADA coordinator needs to be in charge of the reasonable accommodation process, but whoever's doing that in the employment field needs to be part of what I'll talk about in a second, their team. Okay, there needs to be communication occurring. Many times the accommodation can affect the municipality's transition plan. So that's critically important. Qualifications, comprehensive knowledge. Originally, we had just comprehensive knowledge. We didn't add the parentheses. I think this is very important, or willingness to acquire that knowledge. You might not know everything today, but in working with Robbins Center, as well as attending various workshops and conferences and talking with other ADA coordinators, we think you all have the ability to learn. And so we think that's important to add in there. Applicable other and the regulations that accompany those. A knowledge and understanding of all the programs, services, and activities of your municipality, obviously, is a key qualification. An ability to coordinate that input with the variety of municipal staff. And I'll just address that right now. We've seen very clearly that if the ADA coordinator operates, if you will, as a sole operator and does not have liaisons within each department, it's doomed for failure. When we're able to see an ADA committee made up of representatives from the various departments within a municipality, working with that ADA coordinator, communicating with them, providing feedback to them and documentation process, that's when we see our most successful models. Understanding the value of interacting with people with disabilities. It really can't be looked as, oh, good God, I've got to go meet with those people again. Hopefully this person has a very open mind and attitude towards working with all types of disabilities, as Robin indicated. Yes, I'm a wheelchair user, but it's very important that you understand that there's people with communication disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and a variety of others. And so that person needs to be open to that fact. The typical employees that we found filling this position, we strongly believe, it's very good if there's a full-time employment position for that, or if you need to create a new position, either way on that. But we've seen city clerks be involved in being the ADA coordinator, deputy city commissioners, city attorneys, public works staff, community relations officers, and EEOC officers as well. I hesitate to even mention the last one there. My fear with the EEOC officer is generally they are extremely overworked already. And to add on the full gamut of ADA coordination within your municipality probably becomes a system designed to break. So it's up there, but I wouldn't recommend it. Any questions at this point so far? Anyone online, Highland Park, or anyone else? Any questions? Okay, we'll move on. Effective communication. We want to go into this a little bit more if we could. If you can hang on for just a second.
Wait, we gotta get the slides synced here. Something happened. There we go. Okay, we're good.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Okay. Effective communication meets the needs of the individual. Okay. An individual comes into your office as an example, or perhaps calls on a TTY or TDD to your office, or through a relay message relay. How many of you had message relay experience? Gotten calls like that? Anybody else got one where it says this is, what is it, Illinois?
Yeah, or video relay.
Or video relay? Okay. You may get a call, or the ADA coordinator may get this call. And it's basically an interpreter service working with the person who is unable to communicate verbally like I'm doing. And so they may be doing it in another manner, or they may be deaf and unable to hear what you're saying. So they're using that service. And also, it's important to remember that all communication is unique. I know as I worked here in Chicago with Access Living when I first began, somebody said to me, well, once you learn to talk to one person with cerebral palsy, you'll know how to talk to everybody. And it's certainly not true. Everybody's level is at a different point And so I think it's very important that we look at its unique communication. Again, I'm going to just say, this is the person who's the face of your organization to the community. So it's very important that they do understand this. There are no exact standards on how to communicate with people. There's methods that I recommend. For instance, if you're communicating about a zoning issue with a person who uses a wheelchair like myself, I would recommend, if it's going to be a long conversation, that you get down to my level in a chair and sit and talk. If I come by and ask you the time of day, you don't need to get in the chair to tell me. Okay, that's not necessary. But it is very important that you meet the individual's communication style. Building your internal team. This is what I'm talking about. This is what I get most excited about, because I've seen where it works and I've seen with the lack of it where it fails. Obviously, designate that ADA coordinator, giving them the authority to act, as Robin spoke about earlier too. Participating in the budget and planning process is very critical. If you're not getting the input from the ADA coordinator, your transition, your self-evaluation is going to fall way behind. And so it's extremely important that they're able to participate in those processes. Again, if they're working with the community, as we recommend, they should be that ear to the community and be able to pass that on to the decision makers. It's very important that the staff knows who that ADA coordinator is. It's very important the public knows who that ADA coordinator, also who that person's reporting to. We see that those clear lines of authority make a great deal of sense. The best, though, is empowering that ADA coordinator to be able to make the decisions and being able to provide that assistance and also to develop liaisons throughout your multitude of city departments. Again, if we can get a representative from each department forming what I'll call a team, you can kind of think of it this way. Anybody a Cub fan in here? It seems to me that there's been some management changes over the last few years that we might not all agree with, that Rizzo maybe shouldn't have left, and several other players. If you don't have a key leader at the top there, bringing all the parts together like a baseball team, or we'll pick your sport team, it's just not going to work. And so it's critically important that you get all that activity occurring. We need that person to break down silos. It's very much been our experience to see that, we work in X department, and that's the most important department in the city. And doggone it, I'm not going to listen to somebody from another department. That's a trick to do, but something that's very important to bring about the process of truly being able to address your needs under the ADA and sell the positives. Robin knows, and I know extremely well, the first 5 years of the ADA, everywhere we went afterwards was that doggone mandate from DC. That's the last thing we needed. Yet, when you look at your citizenry and the makeup of it, particularly with the aging population right now, you may have a population within your community now of over 30% or close to of people who have disabilities. If you went by households, the most recent study that I've seen, it's 1 in 6 households is affected by disability. So that's pretty important of your citizenry to be dealing with. So I just think that's very important, but it's just serving as you've been doing for all of your careers and serving your citizens, serving your public. It's extending it to make sure we're serving those who happen to have disabilities or their family members in an appropriate manner. Establish the line of communications between the departments. Oftentimes we've heard, well, we can't do that because we've always done it this way. Time to break down that old SOP and create a new one. If that's not working to address the requirements of the ADA, then it has to be changed. So that person has to be patient and persistent. 30 years later, I can promise you that you have to be persistent. Okay. We're going to do an example of a case study. Okay. And we're going to talk about a community festival within your community. And rather than me It's gonna be located outdoors in a city park. Estimated number, 2,000 people. The mayor and some guests are gonna do speaking from a stage. There is gonna be fixed seating in the grassy area. And there'll be some standing room. Jason parking lot will be there. There will be restrooms and drinking fountains available. So my question to all of you is, does the stage need to be accessible? Number one. No? Nobody wants to answer? Everybody's shy? Absolutely. And as we see there, the accessibility route to the stage needs to be accessible. Access to the microphone needs to be accessible, something we had to work with here. Effective communication needs to take place. It used to be unique to see a mayor or a governor or even any sort of representative having an interpreter. Now I don't ever see one without an interpreter. You think particularly the activities of FEMA and things that have gone on when we've had natural tragedies, if you will, or disasters. That communication of an interpreter being available is critical to the deaf community to know what to do. If you saw recently the hurricane in Miami, oftentimes there was the interpreter right there with the person representing the state, and it's very important. What are the accessible seating requirements? Let's say you're gonna have, we said fixed seating, got 1,000 people coming. Let's say you have a couple hundred chairs. And what would we call accessible seating? Where would we locate it? I think as Robin indicated to you earlier, we just sitting in the back of the performance is not acceptable any longer. Generally, when we would run the National ADA Symposium, what we would do in breakout sessions is we left chairs empty every other row within a breakout session, so that a person with a wheelchair could come in and sit either in the front row, the third row, whichever row, just like you all do. Okay. As well as you're going to have to take in consideration if a person has a communication barrier, that there's an area where they can clearly see the interpreter and have a direct line of sight to that individual. So that's very important to take into consideration. The other thing you might want to think about, I'm in the parking lot, the accessible route to there, you say, is through grass. Now, I coached for a lot of years, my son and daughter. Okay, and I did a lot of wheeling through grass, and it's my second least favorite thing to do. Wheelchairs do not ride through grassy areas very well. Okay, so you might want to consider the investment in something like a Moby mat, or even the rental of that could be laid down as is laid down on many beaches. If you've ever been in Florida area, New Jersey, anywhere along the Atlantic coast, I tend to see them. I just don't travel to the West Coast often, so not familiar with whether they're available there. But it's something you can lay down, and it creates a firm in the Park District. Oh, okay. Chicago Park District uses that also, I'm informed. So that would be consideration to do also. Long range, maybe there should be a path that is firm and slip resistant to that area that you're using for a public venue. The parking lot has 2 accessible parking areas. Now, again, we were expecting how many people coming? A couple thousand? Do you think that the 2 accessible spots is adequate? No, I'm saying you're correct. It's not at all. And there's a couple of examples here. If we were looking at 1 in 6 place spots in Illinois, as well as the access aisle on each side of the vehicle. For instance, you go across the river in Missouri, they don't require that. They only require the one side. But Illinois, you require both sides. So could you designate temporarily more spots within that particular parking lot? Sure you can and should. So that you make something reasonable more to reach the 1 in 6 level that the ADA would require. if you're particularly doing an activity, say for seniors or for the disability community, you might want to up that even greater. Again, to me, this is where if you have an advisory committee made up of representatives of a variety of different disability types, as well as organizations, to be an advisory committee to the ADA coordinator in the city, it'd be very helpful because they could assist you with this process of trying to determine, first of all, getting the word out, second of all, providing you input, third of all, dealing with unique situations like this that would come up. You could get their advice. It is a question, as Robin indicated before, that the U.S. Department of Justice is going to ask you is, where did you come up with the decision to do X policy? Where did you come up with the decision to do the following? And you're going to be able to do that. So there is some accessible bathrooms, but it's recognized with this crowd, you're going to have porta potties. And so there are accessible porta potties, and you will need to have those in place as well. I think one of the things that I know I would recommend, and I think Linda might also, is if this is a town festival and you're putting those on the street, do not put them where they lean back against the curb, because generally you've got an arc street and one goes in there and they can't get the door back open because of the fact you're fighting a gravity issue. And so you might have somebody who's actually stuck in there for a while. One of the things we found is when you do that, if you put a slight buildup underneath the back of the porta potty, that won't occur. Or if you find a level ground to put it on, making sure though, again, that's accessible route. And you might say, well, that's just common sense. I have been to more places than I can name to a festival or event, and I can see the porta potties, but I can't get to them. Now you might think, well, what were they thinking? And I wondered the same thing. So again, I think if you have an advisory committee, if you get your ADA coordinator more knowledgeable, this will not occur. Animals, clearly support animals cannot be banned from coming into location. Can you ask for certification of that support animal? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Can you speak in the microphone? Sorry.
I was told no, that you could not ask.
And you're correct. No, you cannot ask for a certification. There really is no certification that would be valid for you. And so it's really, the only thing you could ask is what function does that support animal provide to you? You're allowed to ask that question. The person says, well, it allows me to be able to be mobile and move forward. Support animal. There's other sorts of support animals also.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, so I was at Starbucks and the man came in with his service animal, and the Starbucks employee asked if there was a service animal. He got very irate and upset. The thing is, because it just looked like a dog on a leash. It didn't have all the, things on it. How do you go about that if it looks like just a regular dog on a leash?
There's a couple of things, and Robin knows this. We get the service animal thing, and maybe I'm going down a rabbit hole, but a couple of things have occurred that we've seen. Number one, my parents' generation, if you will, as carried on by my generation, has decided they can't go anywhere without their dog. Okay, and they're going to claim it to be a service animal no matter what. The second thing, though, of the individual biting the employee's head off, I like to remind people, disability does not create sainthood. Okay, we have just made jerks in our population. And so the point being there that there's another way for that person to respond. And that was to indicate what that function provided for that individual, and say, I look forward to my good cup of coffee and move forward. Go ahead, Robin.
The other thing is that I work a lot with businesses and say that you really have to train your employees to make a decision of whether you're going to make it initial or not, because, there's a point where you just like, it's a customer service issue. And if the dog's not creating a problem, there's not an issue other than that, just let it go, because you don't want your staff to have to get into those confrontational situations and stuff that nature. So you really have to kind of decide at what point is it an issue, you know, type of thing. Now, if the dog is disruptive, if the dog is barking, if the dog's nose is in the, you know, Starbucks, sandwich thing, you know, or whatever, now I got a problem. Now I can deny the dog access because its behavior is such that it's not consistent with what we would have in that environment. But I work a lot with venues about really having to train their staff to make a decision of how much you want to get into that issue of challenging, you know, the dog issue.
We'll give you a good example. In one of the symposiums we held in, I can go out of state here to Indianapolis, okay? And there was variety of service animals available there, but there was also dogs there that were not service animals. And we could tell the difference because 3 of them got into a barking contest as well as running freely throughout, you know, our main lobby area. We had to ask those people to leave. Now, understand, when we had to ask them to leave, if they got rid of the dog, they were allowed to return. That wasn't, you did a bad thing, you can't come back. We could only take care of what was the disruptive issue or the wrong issue, which was the claim was a support animal when clearly it wasn't by its behavior. Same thing in a restaurant, right? If suddenly you're missing your ribeye, you know, that's not a trained animal.
Well, and we get a lot of weird questions, like, first of all, it's not appropriate that your dog rides in the grocery cart. You know, the dog should not be in the grocery cart. You know, it's not appropriate. I get calls. I've literally had calls from restaurants where the person has been there and they've ordered a meal for the dog. And the restaurant's like, do we have to do that? No, the restaurant's for people to eat. It's not for dogs to eat. You feed your dog someplace else, you know, type of thing. So, you know, there are a lot of people who will also abuse the service animal issue and things of that nature. Understanding, as Jim said, there are unscrupulous people with disabilities as well as there are unscrupulous people without disabilities, and people will push the envelope. And so it really needs to be a staff training issue and deciding as to what do we allow? What is our level of tolerance, you know, of whatever, and deciding at that point, where do we push it and where do we let it go?
The last area I just want to share here too is obviously, you know, today might not be the good example of this, but if it's mid-July or early August, it can be a little warm out around here. And further out you get away from the lake, I know it gets even warmer. And so you might want to have consideration ahead of time of availability of fresh drinking water. That should be available. If that's available to the general public, has to be available to people with disabilities. You might want to increase that amount or that access to, because for instance, several disabilities, one might not be able to perspire. And so it's critical that they have access to a water source. Along with that, I'd add, think of shade a great deal. I can't remember too many places I've been to, and there's no shade provided at all. And that's critically important for cancer survivors, et cetera. And so I don't need to go too long on that. I just wanted you to think about that. So when you're thinking about this community event, there's a multitude of things one needs to be thinking about that itself involves the multitude of departments within your municipality. And so that's why we think it's so important to create that internal team as well as that external team of folks with disabilities and their organizations to be able to provide you feedback, or they could be family members. So we do think that's very important. Very clear to make who's responsible for temporary events. We have an entire manual that we're giving you a link to about temporary events. And again, like we talked about, the coordination. So the resource guide will be provided, the online PowerPoint, and there'll be hyperlinks on there. And unless we have any questions, here's just a couple examples of the access board, et cetera. Any questions at this time? No, you just want me to be quiet? I'll be happy to. Thank you. Oh, I'm required to do this. I'm supposed to ask did you find this information useful at all? People who are online, we have heads nodding. which I think is a good thing. Is there anything that you think was missing? Anyone online want to comment? Okay, and is there any information you'd like us to put more emphasis on? Yes, sir.
The only thing is just including building officials and plan reviewers in your list of people that are ADA coordinators and typically that's a real common thing in this area. A lot of the ADA coordinators are that rather than clerk's office and things.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Great deal. And we'll repair that.
And do you have any statistics on where these coordinating positions fit? I mean, you have the list, but in this region, is that, how's that reflective?
I'm gonna let Robin answer that. She's done a survey. I'm not sure it included that particular question.
Yeah, so we've been doing some research in our region on self-evaluation and transition plans. And we have one of the questions we do ask in that survey is about the ADA coordinator. And unfortunately, what we have more than anything in that survey is the lack of there even being a designated ADA coordinator, responding back. So, but statistically, I think probably about, I think it showed somewhere around the 40% or so were in some facilities related position. Could be streets and sand, could be building code, could be wherever different, but something to do with facilities.
One last point I wanted to add too is there's discussion about having a group. If you're ADA coordinators, it certainly helps to be able to talk with one another. You're not going to go to local Starbucks and find, a group of ADA coordinators waiting there or your favorite tavern or whatever. And so that's one of the things where we created the ADA coordinator program with the Great Plains ADA Center. But also, my understanding is that CMAP has put together something with the mayor's group. Is that correct?
No.
Oh, good. Sorry.
No, the Metropolitan Mayors Association has a ADA coordinators group. But it is gone through ebbs and flows. The ADA coordinator from Arlington Heights was the chairperson of that and he retired. And so they've kind of had a little bit of a leadership void, but I know that they're trying to pull that back together. But there is an ADA coordinators group within that mayor's.
Oh, if that getting your feedback, would that be something that would be more helpful to many of you that are ADA coordinators to be able to have such a group to be able to meet on an occasional basis? Seeing some nods to my left, nods to my right, and nods to the center. It's all good. I hope you're nodding online too. Thank you all.
And I'll add that in what I'll call the more full-blown version of this, we get into multiple examples, including the building examples, sort of things like that, in which we'll go over the broad range that ADA coordinators see. We are now going to move on to ADA self-evaluation and design standards. This is specifically related to sidewalks, curb ramps, public rights of way. So Robin talked about sort of the global side. Now we're going to get very much into the specifics of sort of the public right of way world. Goals of this module, as I've heard a couple people say today, there's a lot of ADA standards out there. There's federal standards, there's state standards, there's multiple federal standards. Some municipalities have their own local standards. So how you decipher that is important because we all want to build things right, but it's hard to sometimes know what right actually is. Application of those ADA design standards. There are moments in which the ADA standards do not agree with each other. Illinois Accessibility Code was updated in 2018. Prior to that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm getting this right, you had to put detectable warning panels at the top of stairs per the Illinois Accessibility Code. That's what was technically written in the language. They gave you guidance that said that you didn't have to do it, but that hasn't been part of the federal standards for, I don't know, was it ever part of the federal standards, Robin? Yeah, so that ties back to the 1991 standards. The federal standards had already updated that. So what's the right answer whenever the federal and the state don't agree with each other? Lastly, really look at that self-evaluation, what the process is and how we go about doing it. Federal standards wise, Americans with Disability Act from 1991, that's sort of the big blanket document on this. Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the MUTCD, that's your pedestrian signals. And the big thing in that is that's what triggers APS. The MUTCD is really where that discussion on accessible pedestrian signals. So if you're ever walking and you hear the chirps, you hear the cross State Street, all that, all that guidance is coming from the MUTCD. So it's not even part of the ADA, but it is part because it's a requirement. ADAG or ADA accessibility guidelines, those are the updated ADA standards that covers a lot of your buildings, parking lots, things of that nature. Lastly, we have PROAG, which is public rights of way accessibility guidelines. Key thing there is they are still guidelines. We're 20 years now into getting these approved. From the last I heard, they might be approved in like 2025, maybe. So they are still guidelines, but they are guidelines that have been identified as best management practices by FHWA, USDOT, US Department of Justice. I think the federal government has done a good job of saying, we want you to follow these, but I think it's important to note these are guidelines and they have not officially been approved yet. On the state side, there is the Illinois Accessibility Code. That is sort of the umbrella code for the state of Illinois. IDOT has their own requirements. Sometimes they match up with the federal government, sometimes they don't, but they do exist. And on state projects, federally funded projects, you're going to have to follow those IDOT standards. Lastly, local municipalities. The Illinois Accessibility Code and the federal codes never say that a local municipality cannot have their own requirements. That's completely acceptable. That's completely allowed. However, the last thing to note here is that ultimately places the responsibility of compliance on the local municipality. So if you really want to have your own local codes, there's nothing wrong with that. But if the federal government updates their codes and your codes don't match the federal government, then you got a problem, because then you're having a conversation with developers of, well, who do I follow? So there's nothing wrong with doing it. It's just knowing that it's going to fall on you guys to make sure that whatever you have meets federal and state. Next slide, because the big thing here is applying those standards. Federal government, this is from the original Americans with Disabilities Act, says that you are responsible to ensure compliance with all codes. Know your state and local codes, and the more stringent technical requirement applies. If you go to the next slide, it's the exact same thing for the Illinois Accessibility Code. There can always be more stringent requirements. So in places in which they conflict, the answer is always more stringent. The answer isn't always what the federal government tells you to say. If you require something more stringent, the federal government says that's great, require something more stringent. If the state requires something more stringent, the state code says that's fine. Our code governs where it's more stringent. If you're more stringent than us, great, that's more accessibility. Really sort of the key thing with accessibility is more accessibility is never a bad thing. There are minimum standards for accessibility, but if you want something to be more accessible, that's never seen as a negative. Example of this, if you go to the next slide, the sidewalk behind the back of curb. The way that the PROAG reads is it's required to have a minimum width of 4 feet. You have to have that pedestrian access route. It's got to be clear. It's got to be 4 foot wide. However, and that includes up behind back of curb. From the federal standpoint, behind the back of curb, as long as that sidewalk's open, that's okay. However, for state or federally funded projects, if you go to the next slide, it's got to be 6 foot wide. That is an IDOT standard. IDOT requires 6 foot wide sidewalks. We've heard rumblings, I don't know if this is true or not, that there's talk of going to a 7 foot wide sidewalk behind back of curb, of sort of increasing that accessibility. In this case, the federal government says 4 foot wide is fine. The state comes in and says it's got to be 6 foot wide. Who's right? What's the right answer in that case? It's the more stringent. And on the money thing, you're not wrong, because if the state's controlling your money, they're going to make you meet their standards. You can't go back to the state and say, Yeah, but we're meeting federal standards because they're gonna come, if I'm misstating the IDOT, please correct me. But they're gonna come back to you and say, we have our standards and you're obligated to meet those standards. So in this case, that's what this is about. If you go to the next slide. It's that minimum, it's that maximum stringent, the one that provides the most accessibility.
Can you go back one slide there
Oh, yes.
or two? So. Slides now.
I don't have control of the slide, so it might take a minute. One more. Yep. Yes.
I don't think we're asking for 6 foot in our local roads manual. I'll be surprised.
And again, I very well could have pulled this from the BDE.
Yeah, and for a back of curb, the 7 foot is what our requirement typically is. So we either have 5 foot sidewalks, or if you have a parkway in between, or 7 foot at back of curb.
Okay.
So the 6 foot, I don't think I've ever utilized that. I see it in the comment area, but I'm not sure that we've used that.
So this is the interesting part of this, because I'm a consultant. We don't do work in District 1 and District 2. Every other district in the state, 6 foot sidewalks. So again, that's a difference between districts. It doesn't make it right or wrong. They have a more stringent requirement. More stringent is never a bad thing. If the entire state required, say, 7 foot, that's a more accessible state. So I think, oh, go ahead.
So I have a question with that. So if a municipality has a more stringent requirement and the state is doing an improvement in that municipality, but we have our state standards, which one controls? Is there a hierarchy between local, state and federal, or?
So it's the more stringent, but ultimately that's going to come down to your guys' maintenance agreements, in which I don't know how those maintenance agreements are written, in which do you have to go to the city for their approval before you do those improvements? If you do, then they can apply their standards. I know that in some cases, it's your road. You guys can do whatever you want to do with that road. At which point, whenever I would encourage you to follow the city standards, but I don't believe they can force you to follow their standards.
And that's how we've always understood it, is that we always try to comply with the local ordinances. Same thing whether it's water management or geometric design. But it's always a should if you can, but if you can't, it's.
Yeah, and I think that, and again, I know some maintenance agreements are different, in which they say any work done in the city, we have to sign off on. So at that point, maybe the should goes to a shall, but I think those are less common than just the general, you going through the work. Sort of a real world picture of this. Cheryl, if you want to go forward 2 slides.
I don't think that, double check that, your reference on that one, because
Absolutely, yes.
that's not the BLRS manual. I don't think that's in our geometric
Okay.
design chapter. I had to look it up to make
Nope,
sure.
for sure. I got that noted. We'll make sure that the PowerPoint's reflecting proper information. This is sort of a real world example in which this was a sidewalk that was originally built 4 foot wide. Good sidewalk, met the requirements. City decided they wanted to charge for parking. So city goes ahead and puts in parking meters. Nobody thought about ADA. What ADA meant was the space still there. That was honestly, this was probably up the parking division. Public Works might not have even known about this, but they went ahead, they put in the parking meters, and then this is the result of it. I don't know how well you can see, but that's a gentleman in a wheelchair going down the middle of the street. His friend is on the sidewalk on the left side. He's going down the middle of the street. So this is the real world example of why we have to think about this. This does impact lives. I know that for a lot of us, these are lines on paper, but whenever we get out there, we don't want people rolling down the middle of the street because we now charge for parking and nobody thought, is the sidewalk wide enough to accommodate parking? So it is, as we go through this, and this is where the design standards come into play, it's what's actually being built out there. If you're gonna put, allow restaurants into your space, so a 6 foot wide sidewalk isn't gonna be wide enough because they're gonna take up 4 foot of that sidewalk. So it's thinking about that real world, how's the space gonna be used and is it gonna be accessible? We've already had a couple questions, but just take another break if there are any more questions. Not hearing any, we'll go on to the self-evaluation side of this. Robin already talked on this a little bit, but just a quick recap. Self-evaluation is that review of all programs, activities, and services. It's where we document those barriers to access, and it really is an opportunity to get that public feedback. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about public feedback and the value that the public can provide for us. Transition plans themselves, that is how we're going to make those improvements. They're required for municipalities with more than 50 employees. As we already talked about a little bit, that is your part-time help. That is your lifeguards in the summer. That is your street crews that you add in the wintertime for extra snowplow. It's really easy to get up to 50 employees. So if you're anywhere close, odds are you're probably over 50. And it's that plan to provide the access. Really what the ADA and these transition plans are about is providing that access to the programs, activities, and services. It has to be a living document. The problem with sidewalks is if we evaluate every single sidewalk in 1 year, is that sidewalk going to look the same the next year? It's just not going to. So this is where it is. I always describe this as in perpetuity. Sidewalks are something that's always going to have to be dealt with. It's always going to change. And what's compliant today may not be compliant tomorrow. Lastly, it's the plan and the schedule. And again, an opportunity for the public to be involved. What is included in a self-evaluation? Really the big question, and this has kind of been worked through the system, so I think it's been fairly accepted now, is sidewalks and curb ramps are considered a program of the municipality, of the state, whoever's involved. 3 lawsuits on there. If you want to go through and read the lawsuits, feel free to. But basically what it amounts to is communities argued that they don't have to evaluate their sidewalks because it's not a program, service, or activity. Federal government came in and said, it is, you're wrong, you have to do this. And again, the danger of this is they don't just come in and say you have to do it. They come in and say, while I'm here, let's look at everything that you're doing in your community. Let's take a look at your buildings. Let's take a look at your sidewalks. Let's take a look at everything that you do. And the answer is now they're guiding your life. They're guiding how your money is spent. So it's kind of worked through the system that, we have to do these self-evaluations. Self-evaluation itself, there's a multiple of ways to do it. It's all based on the community. It's all based on who you have available. And it's all based on sort of what you want to take on. I can't stand up here and say this is the only way to do a self-evaluation because there is no one way to do a self-evaluation. We can tell you what has to be in that self-evaluation, but ultimately it's going to be on that community to figure out what works best for them. Do you have expertise in-house? Do you have someone available in your office who knows what they're doing to lead this? If you do, then great, that's fantastic. If you don't, then that's maybe when you have to go to an outside consultant. Do you have the time to do it? These are time-intensive processes. So do you have the time as a staff to actually dedicate to completing this? And lastly, the resources. I think it's important that before you take on this operation, you understand what it's going to take to complete it. Because it's a lot of time either on the street or back at a computer based on however you decide to collect the data. But this is a labor-intensive process. So it's important to know that up front, to set that budget up front, and to have realistic expectations as to what it's going to take to get this done. Lastly, as you kind of start to develop this, it's really important to get that community engagement strategy. You want the disability community to be your partner. And the best way to make them your partner is to include them in the effort not to tell them about the effort. If you come back after the fact and say, look at all this great stuff we did, what happens whenever they say, but that doesn't actually matter to us? Like, we don't care about that. Now you have this great self-evaluation, but the disability community doesn't support your plan. There's a chance now that they're bringing up discussions and you got to figure out how to make it right. So it's really that coming up with plans early on. To that end, really community engagement, what we focus on is flexibility. A lot of times our community engagement is we're going to do one public meeting at City Hall, whoever can come can come. Is your parking lot at City Hall ADA accessible? I don't know, we do public meetings at City Hall. Or if we're going to do it virtually, do we need a sign language interpreter? Do people know who to reach out to for that sign language interpreter? So I think, especially on something like a self-evaluation, it's really important to get out into the community, to get out into those under-resourced areas. We know from the plans I've done, I'm assuming you guys have had similar interactions. You probably get the same people who show up to every single public meeting. It's the same people that are interested in it. And how are we reaching out into those communities so they feel like they're part of this going forward? Community events are a great way to do this. Show up, have a little pop-up, they can fill out a survey, and it makes them feel like they're part of it. At the end of the day, everybody loves free food. I like to throw that plug in there. But I think it's important that you look for new ways to do things. You're trying to reach a community that doesn't feel involved in the governmental process. So go out and find them. And I think you're going to find that they have a lot of really great information to offer, but it is going to take some effort on our part to get to them. Next slide. This is a picture of 2 sidewalk vertical displacements. From a pure ADA perspective, both of these are non-compliant. But from a usability perspective, is that the same impact on usability of what's on the left and what's on the right? And I think whenever you get into the self-evaluation, I'm going to make a blanket statement. Hopefully some of you guys are better than this, but in general, probably 50, 60, 70% of our pedestrian facilities aren't compliant. That's just sort of the numbers that I've seen over time. So how do we determine where we're going to start? Because we can't just drop a giant pile of money on this and fix every problem today. So the question is, how do we start that process? And really sort of what we focus on is, or what we think the value is what are those changes that's actually going to positively impact people's lives? What we're trying to do is increase accessibility. And the way that we can do that is by identifying these, if someone's in a wheelchair, they're not getting through that. If someone's in a wheelchair on the right side, they might be able to work their way around it. So that's really that power of the self-evaluation, is that it allows you to plan for the future. Next slide. As we already talked about, there is no method. There's multitude of methods available. Ultimately, it's about what works best for your community. And I think the big thing is start doing something. If you do your budget and you say it's going to take us 10 years to assess our sidewalks, if you start this year, it's better than starting 10 years from now. So that's the thing, is start the effort, start the work, try to develop the budget. If you can show that there's positives coming out of this, maybe it's an opportunity to bring in more money. But I think a lot of times the answer is, well, we don't have money to do this. When maybe the better way to go about this is, how can I start this process and then continue to do it over a period of years? Next slide. Ultimately, is there available staff to do it? How are we going to store and use it? To me, this is always a big question. Someone can come in and, fly your whole city with LiDAR, get you all that data. You have a great self-evaluation. Is there someone in your office who knows how to use that? You can collect everything by paper. There's nothing in the code that says you can't literally go out with pieces of paper, inventory every single curb ramp in your city, document every sidewalk. That's perfectly acceptable. But who's going to do something with those 10,000 pieces of paper? So I think that's where it's, part of this is taking a look at your staff, taking a look at the community resources and what can you guys do with this information? Because if you have a great self-evaluation, but you can't do anything with it going forward, then it's really not going to lead to that transition plan and that action that's required. The self-evaluation is the precursor to action. So if it's not going to be able to lead to action, it's probably not a self-evaluation worth doing. Is there training required? Do we need to go out and get training for people so that they can do this job moving forward? Just different options that are out there. And during the module, there's like an hour and a half dedicated to this, but for brevity today, we'll keep it fairly short. Paper inventory, mobile GIS. You can go out there with iPads, similar to what your water guys might do now, and just document the status of it. ULIP and drone. ULIPs are the segways, if you've ever seen those in videos or anywhere. Drones, you can go around and fly it. The big thing with those is it's a lot of data, and you have to be prepared to do something with all that data. And ultimately, it's going to be on the city. I'm a consultant. I do this with cities. And I think the challenge is at some point, I'm going to go away. I'm going to do a contract for you guys that I'm going to leave. So if you don't feel like you can take on that role after the fact, that needs to be part of that thought process as well. There's proprietary software that's out there. There's new companies every day who have that ability to analyze curb ramps, analyze sidewalks. Very useful. It's quick. They can do it with their own crews, but who owns that data at the end? Do you own the data? So if you don't own the data, then do you have to keep paying them a yearly fee to have access to your self-evaluation? The answer might be yes, the answer might be no, but those are the kind of questions that we need to be asking ourselves. Is the self-evaluation is, as I said before, it's the first step. So it's about coming up with what is going to work for your specific municipality. We can go over questions. I can provide guidance on what I think is better, what I think is worse. But at the end of the day, my opinion doesn't really matter here because it's what's going to work for you guys. So I think it's having that conversation on, okay, what do I have? Do they have time to do it? And what am I going to do with it moving forward? Last part of the self-evaluation, and I think this is a critical part that I don't know how often it's thought of, but cost estimates is a critical component of this. At the end of the day, you can't do action unless you have an idea of what that action is going to cost. And if you come up and you say, okay, I can do sidewalk for $10 a square foot. Sidewalk in, sidewalk out, $10 a square foot, I'm good to go. But what happens when you hit driveways, when you need right of way, when you're relocating inlets? I think through that cost estimating process, it's really important to come up with an accurate number, or else you're just going to lose your momentum. Contingency, always include contingency. Construction costs have exploded in the past couple of years. So it's important to understand the quickest way to derail the momentum on executing the plan is poor cost estimating. You go to your council, you say, I can do 10 miles of sidewalk this year. Give me the money. We're going to start fixing the city today. Then you come back next year and say, guys, I did 5 miles of sidewalk. It was great. And they said, but you were going to do 10. And you say, yeah, but I didn't think about driveways and right of ways and inlets and contingency and everything else. All of a sudden you're having a conversation about what went wrong instead of talking about the 5 miles of sidewalk that you did right. Because if you told them you were going to do 5 miles and you did 5 miles, that's a lot easier conversation for the next year. Design standards, resources wise, there's a ton of these. Just got a couple listed here. ADA standards are out there, 2010 ADA standards are out there, PROAG, IDOT standards are all on their website. So there's a lot of standards available. Really the challenge with those standards is going through them and making sure that you understand sort of where those changes and stringency is. With that, I will open it up to any questions that anybody might have. Yes, ma'am.
So these are all going to be modules, you said, right?
Yes.
So is it going to go over 1 day, 2 days, or self-paced videos?
So the way that this is going to work is we are going to spend, I'll call it 3 hours just on self-evaluation. Talking about that, and then that's our opportunity to really get into what those different options are, the prioritization, the forms, all that good stuff. So this is the quick notes version of it. And then the module is more that opportunity to have the more in-depth conversation. Yes. Any other questions? Not seeing any, we'll go to sort of our 3 overarching questions we've talked about this whole time. Number 1, did you find this information useful? Seeing heads nodding, is there anything you think that we are missing? Anything that in self-evaluations you would like to know more about?
I think it would be beneficial to have examples of self-evaluations.
Agreed.
From, different agencies, because depending on the scale of your agency, the evaluations are going to look very different to many different agencies.
Yeah, and it's a self-evaluation can be a couple pages long for some agencies. For City of Chicago, I assume it's several thousand pages long. I think that'll be something we'll do in that more in-depth module of. And I think one thing that we're also looking at is doing more like breakout sessions in which like large agencies can talk on one side and small agencies can talk on the other side, because they are very different conversations between sort of the scope and scale of what you're looking at.
And I think too, based on what he just said, that if there could be not only just examples, but possibly some municipalities or cities who did the self-evaluations and actually implemented things, that we could see what it was like before they did their evaluations and as they worked on it and, maybe years have passed and this is what it looks like now, like some results of that.
Good deal. I got what I needed out of today. That thought never crossed my mind. I like it.
Yeah, and also, we worked with CMAP on a research project looking at public rights of way where we did just that, evaluated tri-district plans and looked at those that had implemented them, that had done one versus had implemented, because there's a difference. We can share some of that data as well, because we've got some examples, not just Chicago area, but also around the country. So.
Yes, sir.
That's one thing I think, back to the last module as well, is if you've got local examples here, if you can say that Oak Park did a good job on this, or Arlington Heights, or the city of Harvey, or whoever, especially if you've got them different ones that are smaller, bigger, and maybe some that aren't the most affluent communities in the area, I think that will go a long way to helping people, because when they can see somebody that's like us, yeah, it's easy to say Chicago can do this. They got all the resources in the world. It's, or Barrington or some rich suburb. But when you have somebody that's like the size of my community, that I think would go a long way to selling people.
I agree, because it's daunting. It's daunting. It feels like it's daunting. And I think if you can hear from people who did it, it helps. So no, I think that's a great idea. So I handed the.
Yes, I think you should put more emphasis on community engagement, because as you've stated, if it's not done properly from the start or even before the research, you might be doing things that really don't matter to that community.
Come back after the bathroom break and we're going to spend a lot of time on community engagement. It is coming, I promise. And
That really where the community engagement comes into is looking at the prioritization process. It's like, the community engagement to do your surveying is not as much an issue. The issue is now we've got the data. Now we have to make decisions. That's where we want to make sure our community is engaged. So we help with our prioritization process of what's important to us may not be important to them, or vice versa.
any more questions, any more hands? Not seeing any, we are going to take another break. Robin, what time is it? 11:30. Let's meet back at 11:45. And we'll go and sort of do our last module on this. Thank you very much. And again, bathrooms are to the left, pastries are in the back. Thank you. Quick reminder on the modules. And so the way that this is going to work sort of moving forward is that each of these modules is going to be sort of an individual training session. So like for ADA coordinators, there's a chance that you aren't the right person from your community who needs to be in that meeting. So there's no obligation to attend all 4 modules. The hope is that you attend the ones that are appropriate for you. So if ADA coordinator isn't your role, but someone else in your community is, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to them and encourage them to come. But yeah, these are all going to be sort of standalone modules that are meant for sort of that specific group. They're going to be all throughout the region, throughout the next year and a half. And we'll send out more information as that gets closer. So with that in mind, we're going to move into our last section, which is ADA transition plan training. I do note that this is specifically related to the public right-of-way. Development of an ADA transition plan. The beauty of the transition plan is we have gotten pretty good guidance on what a transition plan is. The self-evaluation is one of those components that goes into the transition plan. The transition plan is sort of the final step of all the stuff that we've talked about today. It's really intended to be a living document. It's intended to be something that you refer to, something that gets updated throughout time, something that changes as your community changes. Priorities might change as development happens, that changes priorities in the community. And really the transition plan is your history of the ADA. If anybody ever comes asking you a question and they say, what do you guys do about ADA in your community? Your transition plan should be able, what you can pull out and say, this is what we do. This is where we started in, we'll say 2022. This is where we're at in 2025, and this is where we're going to be in 2030. It's that we have a plan moving forward. And really that's what we're looking for, is to start the development of that plan. 50 or more employees. If you have less than 50 employees, the rules do change, but odds are you probably have more than 50 employees. And lastly, the final document is available for public comment prior to final approval. The community does get the opportunity to comment on this. It doesn't mean you got to hang it from your city hall, but it means that if somebody wants to take a look at it, they have the right to take a look at it. Next slide. So steps of an ADA transition plan. I didn't cite it here, but I did steal this from an NCHRP document that was published probably 20 years ago. And it's a lot of stuff that we've already talked about today. It's where you document that you designated an ADA coordinator. It's where you state that you provide that notice to the public. It's where you state that you established a grievance procedure. So we've talked about all these things today. They're probably in multiple departments throughout your city, but this is that one singular document that you can point to and say, this is what we're doing about accessibility, and this is what we're doing about the ADA. Developing internal design standards. It's completely acceptable for you to say our internal design standards are the state of Illinois standards. You don't have to come up with your own details, design, everything for this. What you have to state though is what you expect within your community. And if what you expect is whatever the state expects, that's good, that works. But it needs to be stated in there what that expectation is. That you've completed your self-evaluation, that you've gone through that process. A big one here is to approve a schedule and a budget. As we've talked about a couple different times today, what we're really shooting for here is that action. So it's not just that we've looked at our sidewalks, this is how we plan to go about improving our sidewalks. And lastly is monitoring the progress of the plan. Who is responsible within your community for monitoring that progress? It may be the ADA coordinator, it may be the public works director. But does the public works director meet with the ADA coordinator once a year to go over how the plan's going? What is the plan to actually monitor it? Because if it's not being monitored, I think what we found is that it just doesn't happen. So the monitoring is a really important part of this. Grievance procedure wise, we already talked about the grievance procedure, but wanted to spend a little bit of time specifically in the public works world of the grievance procedure. Because in a lot of cases, it can be different. A lot of times you guys get calls to your office of, hey, I have a sidewalk problem. That doesn't necessarily go through the ADA coordinator. It doesn't necessarily have to go through the ADA coordinator. If you can meet with them, if you can fix the problem, then that's great. You know, not everything related to the ADA has to go through the ADA coordinator. But what needs to happen is the ADA coordinator needs to be aware of what's going on. All grievance should be handled in the same manner. This makes sense when you say it. In practice, sometimes it doesn't always work out that way, but you know, whether it's a formal grievance that somebody wrote a note to the city or whether it's someone called in and made a complaint, those are both grievances and they both need to be handled. One thing I always like to throw in here is if someone cares enough to file a grievance, that's the person who might care enough to continue the discussion. You know, they've gone through the process, they've looked up on the city's website, they've learned how to file a grievance, they sent you an email. Obviously, they have a concern that they're trying to fix. So it's really important that you go out and talk to that person. It doesn't mean the answer is that you fix their problem, because maybe it's fixable, maybe it's part of a larger process. But it is really important that you go out and have that conversation and that you meet with them and that you talk to them and that you document that you talk to them. Because if anything else comes out of it, that's going to be sort of your first defense of, hey, I met with this person, we have a plan, it's a couple years away, but we understand that this is here and we're working to fix this problem. Look for ways to address the complaint, not loopholes to avoid the complaint. Reach out to them, talk to them. You know, if it's something in which they're elderly and you have to go to their house, I don't think it's acceptable to say our standard operating procedure is they have to come to us. Can you call them on the phone? Can you go to their house and meet with them? You know, look for ways to engage with your community. Do not use the transition plan as a crutch. What I mean by that is, yes, you have a transition plan. Yes, you have a plan for doing this in the future. But if you're getting complaints from a lot of people in the same area saying, we have a problem here, odds are there's a problem there that's actually impacting your citizenry. So maybe that's a viable time to go look at your prioritization and say, okay, what's going on here and how can I help these people? Lastly, all official responses need to be in writing. Talked a lot about going out and talking to people, communicating that value. But at the end of the day, words is what's going to be your record. So it can be as simple as typing up an email and emailing it to your ADA coordinator. I received a grievance on this date. I went out and met with property owner on this date. We went through the process. We fixed the slab in front of her house. Complaint's good to go. Send that off to the ADA coordinator, and now that's part of your record. And really the advantage of that is that's the record of the good work you guys have done in the city. You know, if anybody ever says, well, Public Works doesn't do anything for us, it's no, we helped these 100 people last year. Like, we're doing good things. So that's your record of sort of that. And at the end of the day, it's what is accessible format for the specific user. If it's you give them you tape record your message with them because that's how they want it, that's fine. If that's how they communicate, that's how they communicate. So it's about finding what works for that person and talking with them. Okay, now it's time for our big community engagement section. Big thing about community engagement, it is required under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is a specific requirement as part of the development of the transition plan that you have to engage with the community. What it doesn't say is how you engage with the community. And what I'm really going to advocate for here is trying to get meaningful engagement. Again, we're not looking for the quickest route. We're looking for the route that gets us the best results. So we're going to go over sort of some keys to meaningful engagement and also the phases of it. I think it's really important that community engagement happen throughout the process, not just at the beginning of the process or the end of the process. You want the community to feel like they have a say in this plan. And the best way to do that is to include them in the plan itself. With that being said, the keys: engage the entirety of the community. If you know that through your past community engagement efforts, that there's a certain part of the community that never takes part in community engagement, try something different. You know, obviously that part of the community isn't being reached. A lot of times we put online surveys out there. We know from our census data, if 30% of your community doesn't have access to the internet, what good does online surveys do us? So it's knowing your community. You guys know your community better than anybody else is going to know your community. So it's understanding who you have available to reach before and coming up with new plans to reach them. And when that plan doesn't work, try something else. Like there's no one size fits all. There's no master plan on how to best reach the community. So it's try things out, talk to them. If there's a disability advocate in the community who's a passionate advocate, bring them onto your team. Have them get the word out for you. People want to be engaged in this stuff, especially the disability community. What we find is that whenever you reach out to them, they've been waiting for 30 years for you to make this phone call. They have something to tell you. They just don't know how to get a hold of you. So I will forewarn you that once you engage them, they're going to be engaged, which is a good thing. So reach out to them, make it meaningful, and use community feedback to guide the prioritization. This is really where it helps you to have that conversation of whenever somebody says, why did you prioritize it this way? If your answer is because me and the mayor sat down and it sounded like a good idea, that's one thing. If you come back and you say, we talked to the community and this is what matters to them, that's really a hard answer to fight. Because at the end of the day, you can prioritize things 100 different ways. There's no master plan for prioritization. So it's if you can build the community involvement, then that's your best defense whenever people say, well, you're just fixing their sidewalk because blah, blah, blah. People are always going to have reasons. So if you can engage the community and say, okay, we met with them, this is what matters to them, then that's your best defense against those future complaints. Potential groups to coordinate with, the transit district. They are users on your system. My understanding is that in most cases, the bus pads are theirs, but the sidewalks are the communities. Am I correct in stating that? Does anybody know? It's and then it depends. That's the other answer, is that it depends. So as you work for compliance through the public right of way, the transit district's going to have to be your partner in this. Do they have a transition plan? What's their transition plan based on? How can you two work together to do this so that they're not reconstructing bus pads on one sidewalk and then you're reconstructing a sidewalk a block away, whenever you guys could have come together and made one good compliant sidewalk? So really make the transit district your partner. Residents, this one's obvious, but reach out to them. Service providers, those people who provide services into the community, include them in these conversations. Business owners, they always have opinions. They're not afraid to tell you their opinions, but it's important to have them in this discussion as well. School districts. It is amazing how much the principal at a school knows where his or her kids are coming from. He knows where they're walking to school. They know the problems. They know the challenges. They get the phone calls. So if you involve the school district, they're going to have a lot of information about their schools and sort of the challenges that exist around their schools. Community groups, and lastly, the disability community. It is important that we reach out to the disability community, but I want to spend a little bit of time kind of defining what the disability community is. The disability community is not just those individuals with the disabilities. It's those who support those people. It's not just the child in the wheelchair. It's his parents who are pushing him around. That is part of the disability community. So it's reaching out to that entire community and bringing them into it. Lastly, that dedicated outreach to disability, under-resourced, BIPOC, low income, those communities that we know are sometimes hard to reach out to. Make the effort to reach out to them. I will say that in some cases, you're not successful, but what you can do is document those efforts. So if anybody ever comes back and says, well, you didn't talk to me, and you can say, we held 3 events within 6 blocks of your house. We made efforts. Well, I'm sorry that you couldn't reach, but I'm here now, so let's have a conversation. As opposed to, well, we did a public meeting at City Hall, and yeah, City Hall isn't actually on a bus line, and the sidewalks to it aren't compliant. And we didn't post it on the website. We only put it on Twitter because Twitter's where we put everything. So be cognizant and reach out into those communities. Community engagement wise, there's a multitude of, during the planning stage, start that conversation on community engagement and how you're going to do it. If you're reactive in community engagement, you're always going to be scrambling. If you start this process and someone from the disability community calls and says, why aren't we part of this? Now all of a sudden you're on the back foot. And that's not what we're going for here. Reach out to them early and say, we want you guys to be a partner in this. We want you guys to feel like you have a say in this. And the more they have a say in it, the better off it's going to be for you in the long run, because they understand that you're trying to do what's right. You might not have the money to fix everything overnight, but they know that the community's trying to do the right thing. And maybe that buys you a little bit of grace. During the self-evaluation stage, as you collect that data, how are you going to prioritize the data? Are you just going to assess and say, this is compliant, this is non-compliant? Or are you going to look for shades of non-compliant? If a sidewalk's 2.5%, that's technically a non-compliant sidewalk. However, from a usability perspective, there's a big difference between 2.5% and 6%. Do you want to have a way to prioritize those sidewalks that are greater barriers to access? And if the answer is yes, then you have to know that during the self-evaluation phase. Because if you're not collecting the data to let you do it, then you can't use that data later on to prioritize. During the development of the plan itself, what are the barriers that actually impact your community? What is it that is actually the challenge? Detectable warning panels. PROAG includes it. Is that really a barrier to your community? Is that greatly impacting the community? Or is it more that there's just not a curb ramp that's present? That there's a 6-inch vertical difference between the sidewalk and the street? We can assume what the community is going to tell us. But I've done enough of these surveys now that the community always surprises me, and it's not the same across each community. Every community has a different thing that's their passion, that there's concern. This also gives you an opportunity to figure out where they're trying to go. Because that's the other part of this, is you can start to address the barriers. But if the biggest barrier in your community is a cul-de-sac in the back of a subdivision that gets 3 cars a day on it, is that the best place to start spending the village's money? Maybe it is. Maybe that's your guys' priority. You guys want to focus on barriers. But maybe you want to say, we want to know where the people are trying to get to. And if they can't get to City Hall, that's a higher priority than that cul-de-sac in the back of a subdivision. They're both non-compliant. They both have to be fixed. But one great thing about the ADA is that it does allow you to develop that priorities. It does allow you to prioritize. There's an acceptance that this is going to take some time. In the original, you got 3 years, but I think we've moved to a point now in which there's an understanding that this is going to take some time. So do you want to prioritize that so that you're fixing those areas that people are actually trying to do? The other advantage of that is they're going to see the positives that you're making in your community, and that helps to build that momentum. If all they're seeing is the cul-de-sacs in the back, they're going to say, what are we spending our money on whenever I'm trying to get here? But if the community is the one guiding that decision, all of a sudden you have a team with the community instead of trying to figure things out with the community. Ongoing engagement, federal grant opportunities. If you're going after a federal grant, is that an opportunity to include sidewalks in that federal grant? Is it an opportunity, to improve the pedestrian access route? How does that work? I think that's an area that CMAP does offer sources in, is in that federal grant process. And sort of how can you use federal grant money to get that long-term goal of your transition plan? And then large-scale public works project. If someone's coming in with a large-scale development in your community, how's pedestrian access going to be a part of that? How are they going to get from there to where they need to go? How can you use developers to upgrade the facilities around that development? To have that conversation of, okay, this is going here, where are they trying to get to? And those are all great times to really involve the community. That was a lot of talk on community engagement, so just wanted to take a break, see if anybody had any questions. Not hearing any, we will go on to the actual development of a transition plan. So now you've gone in, you have an ADA coordinator, you have a notice, you have a greetus, you've done your self-evaluation, you've talked to your community, you have all this information. How does this information turn into anything of value? And that's really where that implementation plan is going to come in. Because I think it's important to note that sidewalks are an asset to be managed. Like your roads, like your streets, like anything else in the community, they're an asset. They are a positive to your community. The residents enjoy the sidewalks. They get in benefit out of the sidewalks, and it's an asset to be managed. So what are the cities and communities' priorities in that? We've already talked about it from community engagement, but the transition plan is where you can really look at where are they trying to get to and what's stopping them from doing it. And if you can solve, and if you can identify those two things, the prioritization lays itself out really easily. It's something in which you know that they want to get to the park and they can't get to the park because of there's no curb ramps leading to the park. What's your priority? Add curb ramps. You know, you have a prioritization that naturally lays itself out. I am an advocate of GIS software in this, in that it allows you to process a large amount of data very quickly. It doesn't mean you have to use it, but there are tools out there that allow you to quantify what that prioritization is. If you're not going to do that, my suggestion would be in the transition plan to document using words how you developed your priorities. We developed our priorities based on this, this, and this. And ultimately what this does is it promotes transparency. If anybody ever comes, well, you haven't fixed the sidewalk in front of my house yet. It's your opportunity to say, this is how we're choosing to prioritize things. This is who was involved in that discussion, and this is our plan moving forward. Next slide. I think it's really important in developing a schedule to focus on an achievable schedule. To lay out something, and achievable doesn't mean the least amount possible. You're going to have to push yourself. You're going to have to push your leaders. But I think it's important to settle on something that you can do and that you can do repeatedly. But as you go along, continually review and update. If the financials at your community change, but you spend $200,000 on sidewalk every year, but your city's budget goes from 10 million to 50 million, 200,000 probably isn't the right number anymore. So as the community changes, the schedule changes with it. And also identify short-term and long-term goals. The short-term goals are those high priority projects, those high impact projects. The long-term goals might be the federal funding opportunities, or you know this area is going to be developed in the future. So maybe that impacts your schedule moving forward because you know that you can utilize some other funds to make that happen. But you're documenting it and you're showing how it's going to happen in the future, but it's just not going to happen today. I'm a big advocate for seed projects, those small projects that you can point to and say, we are making a difference. This used to not be accessible. Now it is accessible, and we connected a school to a park. Identifying those projects that don't necessarily cost a lot, but have significant impact to your community. Because at the end of the day, accessibility is a long-term commitment. This is going to be a process. Even if you're completely compliant today, you're not going to be completely compliant tomorrow. So this is going to be part of the public works life for the rest of time. And the advantage of the transition plan is that you're able to develop a plan to address it. And it's a long-term plan, it's a long-term effort, but it can happen if you're smart with it, if you push where you need to push, and you can start actually implementing projects. Funding source-wise, federal funding is available for applicable projects. State funding can be available for select projects. Dedicated local funding source. Is there an opportunity to say, we're going to spend this much money a year on sidewalks? And private developers as well. Within your community, whenever someone comes in and builds a strip mall, do they have to rebuild the sidewalks on the public right of way in front of that strip mall? If they don't, maybe that's an opportunity to act out your transition plan, but using a third-party source to do that. I know there's other conversations that go on in that, but if the community's open to it, it might be a good option. Lastly, incorporating improvements into other projects. Scalability is important. I'm not a big proponent of doing these small scale projects because you just don't get the efficiency in construction. They still got to go out there. They still have to mobilize. You know, can you build this as a package in which they can go out and do 10 small projects that are all close to each other? If there's previously planned projects, can you work accessibility into that? One thing that we did with one of our communities is as they go about and they do their street projects, they look and see if there's any really high priority curb ramps that are like a block off that project. And they'll work that in through another funding source, but they'll use that same contractor that's already out there to fix those curb ramps and then use them. Now, I will say, we're not talking federally funded projects here, but on like city funded projects, you can pick and choose and sort of look out of the box a little bit to make those improvements. Prioritization is a guide and not gospel. If you have the opportunity to improve a sidewalk, improve that sidewalk. If that's third-party funding, if that's state funding, federal funding, don't say, well, this is a higher priority, so we have to go after that. Getting funding is a competitive process. And if the competitive process leads you to doing that street, the transition plan is not here to stop you from doing that improvement, because that's still making your city a more accessible city. Lastly, I like this statement on here. The residents who calls with a grievance is the highest priority. Not necessarily that you're going to fix their problem, but you're going to reach out to them and talk to them about their problem. And if their problem is fixable, fix it. If it's not fixable, explain why it's not fixable moving forward. Went through a lot there. Just want to kind of open it up for questions, see if anybody had any questions on that. Not hearing any, sort of the same thing we've done the whole time. Number one, did you find this information useful? Second question, is there anything that you think we are missing about the transition plan? I think one thing that we'll go over in the module is how to break down a transition plan so it just doesn't feel so daunting. It feels like such a big operation. And I think the module is going to provide that opportunity for us to really have that conversation on how this can be done and how to start that process.
I was going to say, I go back to examples. I'm an
Absolutely.
engineer, so I'm a visual person. So, if you have good examples of transition plans that are out there that can be referenced. I know when we were doing ours on the state side, seeking out other agencies and their transition plans was really key for us to get a good visual idea, understanding what it entails.
Yeah, and I think even if you don't copy it, it's getting it to look at, say, okay, yeah, this is what it looks and feels like, because right now it's like kind of just conceptual. And so you can actually see, okay, this is how they phrased things, or this is how they did whatever. And then we can kind of carry that over. We would totally agree with you that. And I think we plan on providing
Yeah.
you with those kinds of examples, and even some of the forms that people have used and created and stuff like that, that again, may not be exactly what you use, but it gives you an idea of what you might want to collect or how you might want to collect it. You might want to do it differently.
And I think along with those examples they need to be scalable examples in which it can't just be we can't use your guys' transition plan as an example because that's not appropriate to a community with 4,000 people. It's that scalable in which this is what a small plan might look like. This is what a large plan might look like. And that your plan doesn't have to exactly look like this, but it gives you a framework to start off of.
And also I've worked with entities that have done what I would consider a 1,000-mile view above, and those that have done like a 500, foot view, which is extremely detailed versus the more, kind of, nuanced type, and I think that's a choice people make.
Lastly, is there any information you'd like us to put more emphasis on?
Okay, I'm gonna go back to my community engagement. Just like the long-term commitment to accessibility, it's the same with the community engagement. It has to continue even as you do the first priority or second, because they need to assess it and see if the priorities change. So it's also a long-term commitment.
Agreed, and I think that's where if you have an accessibility committee or something like that, who's part of the discussion, I think that's where those committees can become really valuable, in which it's a group you can reach out to say, okay, we're looking at changing our prioritizations. What do you think? Who do we need to reach out to? And it's kind of that trigger to kind of continue to engage the community moving forward.
And a lot of communities in the Chicagoland area have formed advisory committees or like mayor's councils, or, they give them fancy names or whatever, of people with disabilities that represent across a section of people with disabilities, family members, service agencies, et cetera, for ongoing things, not just this, but for other things, and that you can go back to and that are engaged with you and, are messaging out into the community for you. They become somewhat of your ambassadors as well about what you're doing, and a good feedback loop, and connect you with other people, because it's not a finite situation. So.
Thank you for all the resources you're putting up, but one thing we could use maybe is some of the companies that could help us, like you're a consultant, but if we wanted to hire somebody to do some or all of it, just like we sometimes struggle to find interpreters for a music event or something, somebody that does, those kind of things, this would help us. We had a list.
Okay, yeah, that's something we can certainly work on as well. Oh, yes, sir.
And I was going to ask, is there anywhere to go if you run into legal review that's more interested in just meeting the minimum and reducing your liability versus actually doing a more robust plan? I mean, is that something that you run into much? And if you do, what do you do about it?
After that, Rob.
I don't understand what you're saying. You're saying,
I'm saying at the local level, a lot of times, your legal counsel
Oh, yeah.
just wants to do the minimum.
Yeah.
To avoid liability as opposed to care about solving any issues.
yeah. Well, we hear that a lot. I mean, we grapple all the time with legal counsel folks who are, the way they interpret it, or their interpretation, kind of thing. And typically when we run across that and we're working with the legal counsel, is we try to give them the bigger picture of the things that are happening out there, beyond that, like, some of the settlement agreements and other kinds of things that are way beyond, the minimum, type of thing, just so they get a better understanding of the fact that it is not just a compliance issue, the ADA is minimal. I always try to stress to legal counsels and stuff that nature that the ADA is the floor. That's the minimum. You always, can go above and can do more. And that's something I think you would, as a city or a governmental entity, have to decide. Is our approach a minimal approach of only doing compliance? Or are we looking at best practice, which is way beyond that, but that's something you as a municipality needs to decide within yourselves as to what you're doing, because you're going to fight your legal counsel all the way down the road if they're going to come up always with, well, you don't have to do more. The ramp only has to be 1 in 12, and you want to do a 1 in 15. You don't have to do a 1 in 15. You only have to do a 1 in 12. But 1 in 15 is much more usable than 1 in 12. And so what I do is I like to say, lawyer, get in a wheelchair, try to do that 1 in 12 with one hand, not, working as well as the other hand does, and see how you do with that 1 in 12. And then we'll put you on a 1 in 15 and you tell me what the difference is and, which way you're going to go. But, legal counsel is always a barrier. Always, always, always a barrier. I don't have any good solutions or 100% on that, other than you have to decide as an organization, are we strictly on a compliance route, or are we on a usability and engagement route in our communities, and stick to that?
One comment I'd have is, when we looked at transition plans and taught classes to local agencies, one thing that stands out to me is how much is involved in making a park compliant. And you've talked about voting things, you've talked about sidewalks, you've talked about websites, but parks. I'm from Springfield and we have a park that was built a few years ago, Southwind Park, and it was built under the plan of being totally accessible. And it's really become a community resource. And I think there's got to be some examples of that here in the Chicago area. And if you can point to some parks that are accessible, I think that's a challenge that municipalities face, is the park department.
And not every municipality has the park department under their, sometimes it's like park district is totally separate from, municipality. So that's always a catch-22. And I think, again, this goes back down to that breakdown when we start to look at what is a program, service, or activity, because your park is a facility, but the program, services, and activities that occur within that park really what drives more than anything, because you have picnic rentals, you have potential camping, you have playground area, you have, group gathering area, you have hiking, trails, you have a dog park, you have, whatever. So it gets down to what are, one thing is your facility, but then it gets down to the programs that are in that. And that gets really, when you do that evaluation in the self-evaluation, where you're really breaking down what are our programs and then look at what the barriers are to those programs. That's the challenge that you have. And that should be part of the analysis that you get down to when you start breaking down those programs and services.
And I think we can provide examples of sort of how that's been done in the past and the benefits of doing that. So yeah, I certainly think we can add those examples moving forward.
And I'll tell you, there are some people out there, again, when we talk about the consultants and the other thing, there are those that specialize only in the parks and recreation area, that are consultants solely just in self-evaluation transition plan in Parks and Rec, because it is its own beast in many ways, separate from other types of activities and programs. So.
Not seeing any other questions, we'll go to sort of our wrap up of this. First and foremost, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your feedback. Definitely a couple things that heard today that I hadn't even thought of and I think are great ideas. So we really do want to thank you for coming today and for sort of being part of this process. Goal-wise, we are going to have a survey out there in which you can provide your thoughts, provide your comments. As always happens in these things, you think of something 2 days later and you're like, oh, I really wanted to know about that. Or inevitably someone's going to get a phone call today that involves something that we didn't talk about today. So strongly encourage you to go out to the survey. Again, this whole presentation is going to be out on the website. And then we do have a QR code at the end of this as well that'll lead you to the survey. Next steps wise, module 1, which is the first one that we did today, is ADA and Title II training. That's going to be held January 18th at Frankfurt, tentatively. If you aren't the right person in your community to attend that training, strongly encourage you to reach out to them and encourage them to come. Future modules, the ADA coordinator is going to be on March 1st. And then we're going to do self-evaluation and transition plan on 18th and 19th, just because they are such connected to each other. CMAP does have a website out there for ADA stuff. This presentation will be there, future signups, links, support systems, all that stuff will be out there. It has our contact information on it. So if you ever need to reach out to us, feel free to reach out to us. Really the goal of this next year and a half is to give you guys the tools and the confidence and empower you that you guys can do this moving forward. So if at any time you think there's something that we can add to this, we have that flexibility to add to this. This is intended to be a flexible program. This is intended to meet the needs that you guys are looking for. So as time goes on, if a year from now, you're like, you guys didn't talk about this at all, reach out to us. We still have the opportunity to make those changes. Future presentations will dive into more depth, examples, breakout sessions, all that sort of stuff will be part of this in the future. All feedback's welcome. If you don't think we did something well, please tell us, because I really don't want to do something poorly 12 times in a row. I guarantee you that you're not going to hurt my feelings. So if there's something we can do better, let us know about it. Thank you for your time. Online survey is out there. And lastly, just reach out to us. If you have questions, we're here. We're here to try to help. Next slide. Throw out one last chance for any questions before we wrap everything up. Not hearing any. These are our 3 questions to leave it on. If you think of something in the future, please tell us. Thank you very much. Contact information. And then lastly, QR code. So there's the QR code if anybody would like to take the survey now. Otherwise, this is going to be posted online and you can pull it out of there. With that, I thank you very much for coming. We definitely appreciate it. I'm happy with the feedback and thank you very much for taking a part in this. With that, that's all I got.